Across the Atlantic, a king ruled people he would never meet. His portrait hung in public buildings. His name appeared on laws, coins, prayers, and official seals. To millions of colonists, he was not an enemy. Not at first. How was the distant father of an empire, powerful, protected, almost abstract. And then, within a single generation, that image cracked. 13 colonies that had called themselves British turned against the crown. The most powerful empire of its age lost a continent. And the question still lingers. How does a monarchy lose subjects who once believed they belonged to it? To understand that fracture, we have to begin not with a battlefield, but with distance. Not just the distance of ocean and weather, of ships crossing weeks of gray water, but the colder distance between rulers and the ruled, between a king in London and assemblies in Boston, Philadelphia, Williamsburg, and Charleston, between imperial confidence and colonial memory, between loyalty as an idea and loyalty as something people could still feel. This is not a simple story of tyrants and rebels. It is a story of misunderstanding, debt, pride, fear, and political imagination. A story in which both sides believed they were defending something lawful, something inherited, something worth preserving. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. For now, picture the empire at its height. Red-coated soldiers, merchant ships, crowded ports, royal governors, printed proclamations, and above it all, the crown, gleaming from across the sea, certain of its authority. But certainty can be a dangerous thing when it travels slowly. Before the quarrel became a revolution, Britain's American empire rested on a strange arrangement. It was both powerful and fragile, both deeply connected and remarkably loose. From London, the 13 colonies could look like possessions on a map. A long fringe of settlements clinging to the Atlantic coast, valuable, growing, and unmistakably British. Their ships carried timber, tobacco, rice, indigo, fish, flour, and countless smaller goods through imperial trade networks. Their merchants depended on British credit. Their elites read British books, followed British fashions, and often imagined themselves as participants in the same political world as gentlemen across the ocean. But maps have a habit of lying by omission. They show territory without showing time. They show borders without showing the weeks it took a letter to cross the Atlantic. They show authority without showing the awkwardness of enforcing that authority from thousands of miles away. A royal command could be written in London with confidence, sealed with all the proper ceremony, and then sent into a world where winter storms, contrary winds, colonial politics, and local habit could soften it before it ever became real. By the time instructions reached a governor in Massachusetts or Virginia, circumstance might already have changed. By the time that governor sent his explanation back, another season had passed. Distance did not make empire impossible, but it made empire negotiable. That is one of the details often missed in the cleaner versions of the American Revolution. The colonies did not wake up one morning and discover they disliked British authority. For generations, they had lived with it, argued with it, used it, evaded it, and wrapped themselves in it when it suited them. They were not outside the empire. They were inside it, but inside it in a way that encouraged a powerful local confidence. Colonial assemblies mattered. They raised money, debated taxes, protected local privileges, and developed their own political personalities. Men who served in them did not see themselves as minor clerks waiting for instructions from London. They saw themselves as defenders of inherited English liberties in American conditions. That phrase may sound abstract now, but in the 18th century it had weight. It meant that taxation should not be arbitrary. It meant that property had political meaning. It meant that government, even royal government, was expected to move within limits. And because those assemblies had long been allowed to function with considerable autonomy, habit became principle. A practice tolerated for decades can begin to feel like a right. A compromise repeated often enough can harden into an identity. This was the quiet transformation taking place across British America. The colonists were loyal, but their loyalty had been trained in a particular way. They were loyal to the crown as long as the crown seemed distant, protective, and compatible with their local self-rule. That was the delicate balance. Britain possessed an empire, but it did not always govern that empire with the closeness later imperial officials might have expected. Much of the system depended on trade laws, patronage, local cooperation, and the willingness of colonists to accept that the empire was useful. A colonist could think of himself as British while still assuming that his own assembly had the proper authority to tax him. A merchant could praise the empire while quietly resenting regulations that interfered with profit. A lawyer could toast the king while arguing that Parliament's reach had limits in America. None of these positions seemed contradictory at first. They were part of the loose grammar of empire. The crown was a symbol that could hold many meanings at once. To some, it represented protection from foreign enemies. To others, it was a legal umbrella under which colonial rights existed. To many, it was simply the distant center of a world they had inherited. George II, and later George III, did not have to be personally known to be honored. The monarchy worked partly because it could be imagined, but imagination is not the same as intimacy. A king across the ocean could be revered in portraits and proclamations, yet remain untouched by the practical realities of colonial life. London officials could speak of American subjects, but they rarely understood how different those subjects had become from people in Britain. The colonies were not one society either. New England towns, Chesapeake plantations, Middle Atlantic ports, and southern rice colonies lived by different rhythms. Religion, labor systems, settlement patterns, and local economies varied sharply. Even the idea of America as a shared political identity was still incomplete. And yet, beneath those differences, a common habit had formed, the habit of managing their own affairs. This is where the empire's strength concealed its weakness. Britain had allowed the colonies enough room to grow rich, populous, and politically experienced. That success made them more valuable, but it also made them less willing to be treated as dependent children when London later decided the household needed stricter rules. The colonists had learned loyalty in an empire that often left them alone. London, meanwhile, could look at the same history and draw the opposite lesson. British leaders might argue that imperial leniency had been generosity, not surrender. The colonies had benefited from British naval power, British markets, British wars, and British protection. Surely, When the empire asked for obedience, that obedience was not tyranny. It was the price of belonging. Both views had logic behind them. That is what made the conflict so difficult to resolve. If one side had simply been foolish, the story would be easier. But empires rarely break only because someone makes a single mistake. They break when expectations, built slowly over time, become incompatible. Britain believed sovereignty had always remained at the center. The colonists believed their local liberties had become part of the imperial bargain. For years, those beliefs could coexist because no one pressed them too hard. Then the pressure came. The ocean that had once made compromise necessary now made misunderstanding easier. Each side saw the other through delay, rumor, newspapers, angry petitions, and official reports written by men with reputations to defend. London saw disorder where colonists saw constitutional resistance. Colonists saw conspiracy where British officials saw administration. Every message crossed the Atlantic carrying not only words, but suspicion. So before stamps, tea, troops, or declarations, the empire had already developed a fault line. It ran through the meaning of loyalty itself. Were the colonists loyal subjects because they obeyed Parliament, or because they defended what they believed were the true liberties of British subjects? Was the king a distant protector of their rights, or the head of a government that could command them without their consent? Could an empire spread across an ocean remain one political family when part of that family had no direct voice in the legislature claiming authority over it? These questions did not yet demand independence, but they made independence imaginable. And in the history of revolutions, that is often the first dangerous step. Not the musket fired, not the law resisted, not the crowd gathered in the street, but the quiet moment when people begin to picture a world in which the old authority is no longer necessary. The empire did not begin to break in a moment of weakness. That is one of the ironies at the center of this story. Britain's American crisis grew out of victory, not collapse, not invasion, not humiliation. Victory. In the final years of George II's reign, the British world was locked in a struggle far larger than the 13 colonies themselves. Across North America, the Caribbean, Europe, West Africa, and India, Britain and France fought over trade, territory, influence, and prestige. To later generations, the 7 Years' War can sound like a single conflict with a neat name and a tidy place in a textbook. But for the people who lived through it, it was a sprawling imperial emergency, a war fought on several continents, with the Atlantic acting less like a barrier than a corridor of ambition. In North America, the conflict was especially intimate. British colonists had long looked westward toward the interior of the continent, while French power stretched through Canada and down the Mississippi Valley. Between them lay forts, rivers, trading routes, native nations with their own interests, and frontier communities that often understood imperial rivalry not as grand strategy, but as danger near the tree line. The colonists did not experience the war only as British subjects watching events from a distance. They sent men, they supplied food, they endured raids and fear. They argued with British commanders. They discovered, sometimes bitterly, that imperial soldiers and colonial militias did not always respect each other. A farmer from Massachusetts and an officer trained in Britain might both serve under the same flag, yet see discipline, status, and duty in very different ways. That mattered, War has a way of revealing the hidden structure of relationships. It shows who commands, who pays, who sacrifices, and who is expected to obey. During the war against France, Britain learned how much it needed the colonies. The colonies learned how strongly Britain expected to lead them. Neither lesson disappeared when the fighting ended. George II did not live to see the American Revolution. He died in 1760, before the final peace settlement and before the imperial arguments hardened into open resistance. But the last years of his reign set the machinery in motion. Under his crown, Britain fought the war that would remove France as the most immediate threat to the American colonies. Under his crown, Britain poured money, men, ships, and administrative attention into an imperial contest that brought enormous gains and enormous costs. It is tempting to imagine the removal of France from Canada as a gift that should have made the colonists more grateful and more secure inside the British Empire. In one sense, it did. The fall of French power changed the psychological map of North America. For generations, British colonists had lived with a rival Catholic monarchy to the north and west, a rival that could ally with native powers, threaten frontier settlements, and restrain colonial expansion. When that threat was reduced, the empire seemed to have opened a door. But doors can open in two directions. For Britain, the victory created an argument for reform. The empire had grown larger. The frontier was more complicated. The cost of defense had risen. The national debt had swollen. The old loose arrangement, where colonial governments were often left to their own habits until a crisis appeared, looked increasingly inadequate to officials in London. A victorious empire needed order. It needed revenue. It needed a way to manage its new possessions and protect them without bankrupting itself. For many colonists, however, the same victory produced a very different conclusion. If France had been defeated, why did America now need more British troops? If the colonies had helped defend themselves, why should Parliament suddenly impose new financial burdens from across the ocean? If the danger had lessened, why did imperial control seem to be increasing? The war did not answer these questions. It created them. And this is where the story becomes more subtle than a simple tale of taxation. Money mattered, of course. Debt mattered. The British state had spent heavily, and British taxpayers already carried substantial burdens. From London's perspective, it seemed reasonable that the colonies, which had benefited from imperial defense, should contribute to the cost of their own protection. There was a plain household logic to it. The family had fought an expensive battle, and the American branch of the family should help with the bill. But the colonists did not hear the request as a family conversation. They heard it as a constitutional warning, because payment was never only payment. A tax carried a theory of power inside it. Who had the right to impose it? Who had consented? What precedent did it set? Could Parliament, where no American colonist sat as an elected representative, reach into colonial life and take revenue directly? To many in Britain, these objections sounded legalistic, evasive, perhaps even ungrateful. To many colonists, they went to the heart of liberty. The war had also changed Britain's physical presence in America. Soldiers who had once arrived for emergency campaigns now remained as part of an imperial system. Forts, garrisons, supply lines, and frontier policy became symbols of a new, more watchful empire. London did not see this as sinister. It saw it as responsible management. But people rarely judge power only by its intentions. They judge it by its proximity. A redcoat stationed nearby felt different from a king in a portrait. The British Army in America was not simply a military fact. It became a political fact. It reminded colonists that the empire was no longer just a protective structure in the distance. It could stand in their streets, occupy their buildings, demand provisions, and enforce decisions made elsewhere. Even before the most famous confrontations, the emotional climate had shifted. Protection and supervision began to look uncomfortably alike. There was another consequence of the war, quieter but just as important. The colonies had gained confidence. Colonial soldiers had seen the scale of the continent. Colonial leaders had negotiated supplies, raised militias, and watched British regulars succeed, fail, quarrel, retreat, and advance. The mystique of imperial command was not destroyed, but it was made human. British power could be impressive, even overwhelming, yet it was no longer magical. And when authority becomes ordinary, it becomes easier to question. None of this means the war made revolution inevitable. That would be too neat. In the early 1760s, most colonists were not planning independence. Many celebrated Britain's triumph. They saw themselves as members of a victorious empire and expected to enjoy the rewards of that victory. The emotional break had not yet occurred, but the conditions for the break were now in place. Britain had won land it needed to govern, debts it needed to pay, soldiers it needed to maintain, and officials who believed the empire required discipline. The colonies had gained security, confidence, and an even stronger attachment to their local political rights. One side looked at the post-war world and saw the need for central control. The other looked at the same world and saw the chance for greater freedom. Both believed victory had proved their point. That is the dangerous afterlife of a successful war. The fighting ends. The treaties are signed. The cannons cool. And everyone assumes the meaning of victory is obvious, but victory is rarely silent. It leaves bills on desks. It leaves troops in forts. It leaves new borders to patrol and old assumptions exposed. George II's reign closed with Britain rising to a height few European powers could match. Yet hidden inside that triumph was a question the empire had not truly answered. Could a distant monarchy and parliament reshape colonial life after generations of autonomy and still expect loyalty to remain untouched? The answer would fall to a young king who inherited not a defeated empire, but an overextended one. And sometimes, inheriting a victory is more dangerous than inheriting a crisis. Chapter 4. The Young King Inherits a Victory. When George III came to the throne, he did not inherit a broken empire. He inherited something more deceptive, an empire that looked magnificent from the outside and strained from within. I was young, British-born, and eager to be seen as a moral, serious monarch. Unlike the first two Hanoverian kings, whose roots and personal histories tied them closely to Germany, George III could present himself as something more intimate to his subjects, a king of Britain in language, upbringing, and public image that mattered. Monarchy was not only a system of government, it was theater, expectation, family mythology, and political symbol. A king's identity could become part of how a nation imagined itself, and George III wanted order. That word is important, because it is easy to flatten him into a villain after reading the Declaration of Independence. In American memory, He often appears as a distant tyrant, almost a stage character, stubborn, cruel, blind to liberty, standing in the way of a people destined to be free. The reality is less tidy and more revealing. George III was not an absolute monarch. He did not rule by personal whim in the manner of some darker royal legend. He worked within a British constitutional system of ministers, parliament, patronage, law, party factions, and political pressure. But he was not irrelevant either. He believed monarchy still had a real role to play in guiding the state. He wanted stable government after years of factional conflict. He distrusted disorder, not merely because it threatened his authority, but because he associated disorder with corruption, selfish ambition, and the weakening of the kingdom. To him, imperial reform did not necessarily mean oppression. It meant making the empire coherent after war had exposed its untidy edges. From London, that desire could look sensible. Britain had just fought an enormous conflict. Its territory had expanded. Its expenses were severe. Its American colonies had grown more confident, more populous, and more difficult to manage. Any government looking at that situation would have been tempted to ask whether the old informal methods were enough. And there was the trap. The very qualities that made George III seem responsible in Britain could make him appear dangerous in America. A king who prized order might not understand a colonial political culture built on negotiated disorder. A monarch who saw reform as duty might underestimate how threatening reform feels when it arrives from a legislature across the sea. A government that speaks of efficiency often forgets that people do not live inside administrative diagrams. They live inside habits. For decades, American colonists had lived with a loose imperial arrangement. They had local assemblies, local arguments, local elites, local taxes, local ways of pretending to obey when London's expectations became inconvenient. This was not pure independence. It was not even hypocrisy exactly. It was how the empire functioned. The machine ran because many of its gears did not fit too tightly. George III came to the throne at the moment when British leaders were increasingly convinced the gears needed tightening. Here, the story resists easy blame. The conflict that followed was not caused by one man alone. It was not George III waking in a palace and deciding to lose America. Ministers mattered. Parliament mattered. British voters mattered, though they were represented through a deeply unequal system by modern standards. Merchants, land speculators, colonial governors, smugglers, pamphleteers, soldiers, lawyers, and local crowds all played their part. The empire did not fracture because a single hand struck it. It fractured because many hands pushed in different directions while insisting they were holding it together. Still, George III became central because monarchy gathers meaning. Even when a king does not personally design every policy, his name gives those policies a face. Laws could be debated in Parliament, drafted by ministers, enforced by customs officials, and resisted by colonial assemblies. But for many colonists, the crown remained the highest symbol of imperial justice. At first, this helped preserve loyalty. Colonists could imagine that Parliament had been misled, that ministers were corrupt, that local officials were abusive, but that the king, if properly informed, might still protect them. That belief gave the empire time. It allowed protest to remain loyal, at least in language. Petitions could be addressed to the monarch. Toasts could honor the king while condemning his advisors. Colonists could argue that they were not rebels, but faithful subjects defending the true constitution from distortion. This distinction may sound delicate, but it was politically powerful. It allowed resistance to grow without immediately requiring treason. George III's tragedy, and perhaps the empire's, was that he occupied both roles at once. How was the imagined protector and the constitutional head of the government colonists increasingly feared. The more he supported firm imperial measures, the harder it became for Americans to separate the benevolent king in their minds from the coercive state in their streets. In Britain, firmness could be interpreted as responsibility. A government that backed down whenever colonial assemblies objected might seem to invite disobedience everywhere. What would happen in Ireland, in the Caribbean, in India, or even at home if resistance across the Atlantic succeeded? Empire depended not only on force, but on precedent. Once one set of subjects proved that organized defiance could defeat Parliament, others might learn from the example. From America, the same firmness looked like contempt. That is the mirror effect of imperial crises. Each side sees itself as defensive. Britain believed it was defending lawful sovereignty after paying dearly to protect the colonies. Colonists believed they were defending inherited rights against a dangerous expansion of power. George III believed, as many British officials did, that the empire could not survive if authority became optional. Many colonists believed liberty could not survive if authority became unlimited. Both fears were real to the people who held them, and because they were real, compromise became more difficult. Practical disagreements hardened into moral ones. A tax was no longer just a tax. It became evidence of a design. A riot was no longer just a riot. It became evidence of rebellion. A petition was no longer just a petition. It became a test of whether the imperial family still had a listening father at its head. George III inherited a victory, but victory had changed the emotional chemistry of the empire. The old bargain had depended on distance, flexibility, and the useful vagueness of loyalty. The young king's world demanded definition. Who ruled? Who paid? Who obeyed? Who decided? Empires often survive by leaving such questions half-answered. The British Empire in America began to suffer when it tried to answer them too clearly. So when we look at George III at the beginning of this crisis, we should resist the comfort of caricature. How was not a mad king raging against liberty in the opening act, nor was he a helpless ornament dragged along by ministers. How was an active constitutional monarch with a strong sense of duty, a deep suspicion of disorder, and a belief that imperial authority had to mean something. That belief would not seem extreme in London. Across the ocean, it would begin to sound like a warning. After the war, Britain looked at America and saw a bill. Not a metaphorical bill, a real one, written in debt, interest, troops, forts, ships, salaries, and imperial administration. Victory had been glorious, but glory does not balance accounts. The empire had won territory on a scale that made London proud, and then immediately discovered that new territory had to be defended, governed, negotiated, and paid for. This is where the imperial argument begins to sound, at first, almost reasonable. British officials could ask a simple question. If the colonies had benefited from the war, should they not help pay for the peace? The French threat had been reduced. British arms had helped secure the continent's eastern seaboard. Royal soldiers remained in North America not, in London's telling, to enslave the colonists, but to protect the empire's frontier and preserve order in a newly enlarged world. Seen from Westminster, this was not tyranny, it was arithmetic. The problem was that arithmetic, in politics, is rarely just arithmetic. A tax may be small and still feel enormous if it changes who holds power. A regulation may be practical and still appear dangerous if it arrives without consent. The colonists were not simply counting coins, they were reading the meaning behind the demand, and what many of them saw was a shift from an empire that asked through local channels to an empire that commanded from above. That distinction mattered more than the amount of money. For generations, colonial assemblies had guarded the power to tax. They were not democratic bodies in the modern sense. Many people were excluded from political life, and colonial society contained deep inequalities that should not be smoothed over. But within the world of property holding, male politics, taxation by local representatives carried enormous constitutional weight. It was tied to the older English belief that subjects should not be taxed without some form of consent. So when Parliament began searching for revenue in America, the question became sharper than London expected. Who had the right to reach into colonial pockets? British leaders often believed the answer was obvious. Parliament was sovereign. It legislated for the empire. Americans were British subjects. The colonies were not independent states with a veto over imperial policy. And since Britain had paid heavily to defend them, asking them to contribute seemed not only lawful, but fair. Colonists answered from a different political experience. They did not deny that they belonged to the empire, at least not yet. Many did not even deny that Britain could regulate imperial trade. Trade laws, however irritating, had long been part of the imperial system. But internal taxation felt different. It seemed to cross a boundary between managing commerce and exercising direct power over colonial life. Here, the language of rights became practical, not ornamental. A farmer might not speak like a constitutional lawyer, but he understood the burden of a tax. A printer understood the danger of a stamp duty on paper. A merchant understood customs enforcement. A lawyer understood precedent. A colonial assemblyman understood what it meant when Parliament claimed authority in an area local legislatures considered their own. And perhaps most importantly, many colonists understood the future. They feared not only what Britain was doing, but what Britain might now be able to do. If Parliament could tax them in one case, why not another? If consent could be brushed aside because Americans were virtually represented in a legislature where they elected no one, what limit remained? The immediate policy became less frightening than the principle it seemed to announce. London heard alarmism. America heard warning bells. This is one reason the imperial crisis escalated so quickly after the war. British officials often expected gratitude and cooperation. Instead, they encountered suspicion. They believed the colonies were being asked to carry a modest share of an imperial burden. Colonists believed they were being used to test a new theory of power. Each side thought the other was exaggerating, and each side had enough evidence to feel righteous. The phrase, price of protection, carries a hidden insult when heard from below. It suggests that safety has been provided by one party and consumed by another, as if the colonies were passive recipients of British sacrifice. But the colonists did not see themselves as passive. They had fought, supplied, lost men, raised money, and endured fear on the frontier. Their memory of the war included British help, certainly, but also colonial contribution. So when Britain implied that America owed more, many colonists heard a failure of recognition. This may seem like a small emotional detail beside taxes and laws, but empires often stumble over recognition. People can endure burdens more easily when they believe their dignity has been acknowledged. They resist more fiercely when a demand comes wrapped in condescension. British officials did not always intend condescension, but imperial distance made it easy. America appeared in reports, ledgers, and maps. Colonists appeared as subjects, traders, taxpayers, settlers. Less often did they appear as political communities with a long memory of self-government. There was another layer. Protection itself had become ambiguous. Protection from whom? France had been the great imperial rival, and France had now been pushed back in North America. Native nations still held power and pursued their own strategies, and the frontier remained volatile. Britain's leaders understood that stability required careful management. Many colonists, especially those eager for Western land, saw imperial restraint as an obstacle rather than a safeguard. A British soldier who represented security to one official might represent interference to a land-hungry settler. Protection, like loyalty, did not mean the same thing to everyone. And then there was the presence of the army. To London, keeping troops in America after the war was prudent. To colonists steeped in suspicion of standing armies, especially armies maintained in peacetime, it could feel ominous. The soldiers did not have to behave like conquerors for their presence to change the atmosphere. Their very existence raised a question. Were they there to defend Americans, or to enforce obedience upon them? That question would become more dangerous with time. For now, the empire was still speaking the language of adjustment. Revenue, administration, defense, order. These words are not naturally dramatic, and perhaps that is why they can be so powerful. Revolutions do not always begin with speeches about destiny. Sometimes they begin with paperwork, with budgets, with policies that seem sensible to officials and intolerable to those who must live under them. The British government believed it was repairing the empire after war. Many colonists believed Britain was quietly redesigning it. Neither side fully understood how quickly a dispute over payment could become a dispute over legitimacy. Once legitimacy is questioned, concessions become harder. If Britain backed down too easily, it risked appearing to admit that Parliament's authority had limits. If the colonists submitted too easily, they feared admitting that their assemblies and rights existed only by permission. The conflict was no longer about whether America should contribute something. It was about who had the authority to decide. That is the deeper price of protection in this story. Britain had protected the colonies in war, but the victory gave British leaders a stronger desire to control what they had protected. The colonists had accepted protection, but the removal of the French threat made them less willing to accept control as the cost of it. Both sides looked at the same imperial shield and saw different inscriptions written across it. Britain saw obligation. America saw consent. And between those two words, the old empire began to narrow into a corridor with fewer and fewer exits. The Stamp Act was not the largest burden Britain could have imagined. That is part of what made the reaction in America so alarming to officials in London. To them, the law was a practical revenue measure. It required certain printed materials, legal documents, newspapers, licenses, pamphlets, even playing cards, to carry an official stamp showing that a tax had been paid. It was orderly, bureaucratic, and, from the imperial point of view, reasonable enough. But paper is never just paper when a society lives through contracts, courts, newspapers, sermons, advertisements, shipping records, and public argument. The Stamp Act touched the nervous system of colonial life. It entered the lawyer's office, the printer's shop, the merchant's counting room, the tavern table, the courthouse, the port, and the private transaction. It did not remain hidden in customs accounts or distant trade policy. It appeared where people could see it, pay it, resent it, and discuss it. Perhaps that visibility was its greatest political mistake. A tax that must be noticed invites people to ask why it exists, and Americans asked with unusual force. The dispute quickly moved beyond money. If the tax had been merely expensive, colonists might have grumbled, evaded, negotiated, and endured. But the Stamp Act seemed to announce a new imperial principle. Parliament could impose direct internal taxes on the colonies without the approval of their own assemblies. That was the crack in the wall. Not the amount collected, but the authority claimed. The colonists' argument was not yet independence. In fact, much of the resistance carefully insisted on loyalty. Protesters claimed they were defending the rights of British subjects, not inventing a new nation. They argued that taxation required consent, and that consent could not be fictional. Britain's theory of virtual representation, the idea that members of Parliament represented the interests of the whole empire, not only their direct voters, sounded thin in America, where no colonist had chosen those lawmakers, and no colonial voice could remove them. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," has become so familiar that it can feel almost decorative now, like a slogan printed on a school poster. But in the crisis of the 1760s, it carried a sharp constitutional edge. It was a challenge to the structure of empire. It asked whether British liberty could survive across an ocean if representation did not cross with it. This was not only an elite debate, although elites shaped its language. Lawyers wrote arguments, assemblymen passed resolutions, merchants organized pressure, printers spread essays and news from colony to colony. But crowds also entered the story, and crowds changed the temperature. Stamp distributors were threatened. Effigies appeared. Homes were attacked. Public rituals of humiliation turned private disagreement into communal theater. Men who accepted office under the Act discovered that an imperial appointment could make them socially and physically vulnerable. The resistance was not always polite. It was not always controlled by the respectable men who later tried to give the movement a constitutional face. That tension would never quite disappear from the revolution. The cause of liberty often depended on popular pressure that frightened even some of its supporters. Here is one of the uncomfortable truths of the Stamp Act crisis. Colonial resistance succeeded partly because it combined principle with intimidation, argument with disruption, lofty language with street power. Petitions alone might not have forced the issue. Violence alone might have been dismissed as disorder. Together, they created something more formidable, a movement that could speak like lawyers and move like a crowd. London did not know what to do with that combination. For British officials, the colonial reaction seemed wildly disproportionate. How could subjects who had benefited from imperial protection treat a modest stamp duty as an assault on liberty? Were they being manipulated by smugglers, ambitious lawyers, or local demagogues? Was this really constitutional conscience, or just tax avoidance dressed in noble language? These questions were not entirely foolish. Some colonists did have economic motives. Some leaders did gain influence through resistance. Smugglers and merchants had practical reasons to dislike tighter enforcement. Political movements are rarely pure, and the American resistance was no exception. But Britain made a serious mistake when it treated self-interest as proof that the constitutional argument was insincere. People often defend principles most fiercely when those principles touch their material lives. A tax on paper could be both inconvenient and ideologically offensive. A merchant could resent lost profit and still believe Parliament had overstepped. A printer could fear business damage and still see a threat to public liberty. Motive does not have to be immaculate to be real. The Stamp Act Congress gave the resistance a more formal shape. Delegates from several colonies met and articulated grievances in a shared language. That was significant. The colonies were not naturally united. They had different economies, religions, social structures, and rivalries. But the act created a common problem that could be discussed in common terms. It taught colonists to look sideways, toward one another, not only upward toward London. This may have been the act's most lasting consequence. It trained resistance. Before the Stamp Act, colonial complaints often remained local or scattered. After it, colonists had models for cooperation. Committees, congresses, non-importation agreements, for networks, public declarations, crowd action, symbolic protest. A political muscle had been flexed, and once people learn their strength, they do not easily forget it. When Britain repealed the Stamp Act, many colonists celebrated. Bells rang, toasts were made, merchants breathed again. Loyalty seemed recoverable. The empire had bent, and perhaps that meant the old relationship could be repaired. But repeal carried its own ambiguity. Britain did not simply say, "We were wrong. Parliament has no such authority." Instead, it paired retreat with a declaration of sovereignty. In effect, Parliament insisted that it still possessed the right to legislate for the colonies. To British leaders, this protected constitutional dignity. They could withdraw an unpopular tax without surrendering principle. To colonists, it left a blade on the table. The immediate wound had been treated, but the weapon had not been removed. So the Stamp Act crisis ended, and did not end. It revealed that colonial resistance could be organized across borders. It showed that public's opinion in America could make imperial policy difficult to enforce. It taught British officials that firmness might provoke defiance, but also that retreat might encourage more of it. It taught colonists that protest could work, but also that Parliament had not abandoned its claims. Each side learned a lesson that made the next conflict more likely. The personal image of the king remained, for the moment, somewhat protected. Many colonists still blamed ministers or Parliament more directly than George III himself. They could imagine that the monarch had been poorly advised, or that he remained above the uglier mechanics of revenue and enforcement. This mattered because it preserved a path back to loyalty. The king could still be pictured as the figure who might restore balance. But the empire's language had changed. Before the crisis, Americans often argued inside the assumptions of British belonging. After the Stamp Act, they still did, but with a sharper awareness that belonging might become a trap if rights depended on distant interpretation. They had not yet rejected the crown. They had, however, begun to separate the idea of liberty from the comfort of imperial obedience. That separation was the first crack, not a clean break, not yet a revolution. More like the faint line in glass after pressure has been applied from both sides. At certain angles, it can almost disappear. Then the light shifts, and suddenly it is all you can see. For a time, the colonists still spoke like loyal subjects. That is one of the most important things to remember, because it prevents the story from becoming too simple. The road to independence was not a straight road. It was crooked, hesitant, crowded with people who disagreed with one another, and full of men who were not yet ready to call themselves revolutionaries. They condemned taxes, yes. They criticized Parliament. They mocked customs officers. They organized boycotts and celebrated resistance. But many still toasted the king. Many still imagined themselves as Britons defending British liberty against corruption, not Americans escaping Britain altogether. This distinction was not a disguise, at least not at first. To many colonists, loyalty to the crown and resistance to Parliament could live in the same sentence. The king, in their imagination, stood above the daily machinery of policy. Ministers could be wicked. Parliament could overreach. Local officials could be greedy, arrogant, or foolish. But the monarch might still be appealed to as a guardian of justice. That belief gave colonial protest a kind of emotional shelter. It allowed men to resist authority without admitting, even to themselves, that they were beginning to loosen the deepest bond of empire. And then came the dangerous ideas. They did not arrive as a single doctrine, folded neatly inside one pamphlet. They moved through newspapers, taverns, churches, ports, private letters, assembly debates, and crowded rooms where men argued late into the evening over ink, debt, taxes, and rights. The ideas were often old, but the American crisis gave them new force. Consent, representation, property, liberty, corruption, tyranny, natural rights, the ancient Constitution, the rights of Englishmen. Words like these can sound tidy when placed in a textbook. In the 1760s and 1770s, they were anything but tidy. They were weapons, tools, shields, passwords, and sometimes masks. A merchant might use the language of liberty to defend trade. A lawyer might use it to define constitutional limits. A farmer might hear it as protection against distant power. A printer might see in it both principle and business opportunity, which is not the worst arrangement for a printer, historically speaking. Pamphlets mattered because they allowed political thought to travel faster than official authority. A royal order crossed the Atlantic slowly. A printed argument could move from hand to hand, from town to town, and from colony to colony with surprising speed. It could be read aloud to those who could not easily read it themselves. It could be excerpted, attacked, reprinted, misunderstood, improved, and turned into common language. In a world without modern media, print created a kind of political weather. You could feel it before you could measure it. The colonial newspaper was not merely a source of information. It was an arena. Printers chose what to publish. Essayists wrote under classical names. borrowed identities, and carefully sharpened phrases. Reports of resistance in one colony became encouragement in another. A crowd in Boston could become a lesson in Philadelphia. A resolution in Virginia could be studied in Massachusetts. Local grievance began to acquire continental rhythm. This is where the empire's geography began to work against it. Britain was separated from America by an ocean. The colonies were separated from one another by distance, poor roads, rival interests, and local suspicion. Yet the crisis itself helped build connections. Every disputed law became not just a burden, but a message. Your problem is also our problem. Your precedent may become our precedent. Your defeat may prepare our defeat. It is difficult to create unity among communities that do not yet fully think of themselves as one people. But fear can be an efficient organizer. So can pride. Colonial assemblies became stages where local leaders performed a careful balancing act. They framed resistance in legal and constitutional terms, trying to appear principled rather than chaotic. They insisted that their claims came from British tradition itself. They were not rejecting the empire, they argued. They were calling it back to its better self. There is a quiet irony here. The colonists' most radical future grew out of conservative language. Many did not begin by demanding a new political world. They demanded the restoration of an older one, or at least an older one as they understood it. They imagined that the true British Constitution protected them from taxation without consent, from standing armies used against civilians, from distant lawmakers who treated local rights as favors. But once people learn to argue from principle, the argument can travel beyond its original destination. If taxation required consent, what else required consent? If power became illegitimate when it ignored local rights, how far did that principle reach? If liberty belonged to British subjects because of inheritance, did it also belong to people by nature? These questions did not all arrive at once, and not everyone welcomed them. Some colonists feared that too much political language might unsettle society from below. Enslaved people, poor laborers, women, native nations, and dissenting religious groups could hear the rhetoric of liberty and draw conclusions that elite patriots did not always intend. That is one of the great contradictions of the Revolutionary era. The language grew larger than the society that first used it. For now, however, resistance remained focused on imperial power. The colonists were not one ideological army. Some were radicals. Some were cautious. Some opposed British policy, but feared mob violence. Some cared mainly about trade. Some remained deeply loyal to Britain and saw the protest movement as reckless, even dangerous. The term colonists can hide a crowded human landscape. There were loyalists before there was a fully formed revolution. There were neutrals, opportunists, skeptics, and people simply trying to survive uncertain times. Not every man who disliked a tax wanted independence. Not every person who cheered a protest wanted war. Public movements have a way of making disagreement look smaller than it is, because the loudest voices leave the clearest records. Still, the pressure continued. Merchants organized non-importation agreements, refusing British goods as a way to make economic resistance visible. These boycotts were not merely financial tactics. They turned consumption into politics. What you bought, what you wore, what tea you drank or refused to drink could become a statement. Private life began to carry public meaning. That is a subtle but powerful transformation. When politics enters the household, the shop, the dinner table, and the fabric of everyday choices, it becomes harder to contain. A law debated in Parliament could now affect the cloth on a person's back and the sugar in a cup. Empire was no longer distant. It had become intimate. Street movements added another. Groups like the Sons of Liberty helped organize resistance and give it symbolic force. They understood theater, effigies, processions, public resignations, liberty trees, and ritualized defiance turned abstract constitutional arguments into scenes people could remember. This was politics as performance, and performance mattered because it taught people how to feel together. But performance also carried risk. Crowds could exceed the intentions of their organizers. A protest meant to pressure an official could become destruction. A symbolic act could become violence. Respectable leaders sometimes depended on popular energy, then recoiled when that energy threatened property or order. The movement against Britain was not a perfectly disciplined choir. It was more like a room full of instruments tuning at once, noisy, unstable, occasionally harsh, but gradually finding a shared key. And through all of this, the figure of the king still hovered above the conflict. George III was not yet, for many colonists, the central enemy. That would come later. For the moment, he remained useful as an imagined alternative to Parliament's arrogance. The colonists could send petitions upward. They could hope that the monarch might listen where ministers had not. They could preserve the emotional structure of loyalty while attacking the policies carried out in his name. But this arrangement was becoming harder to maintain. Every imperial measure blurred the distinction between king, parliament, and ministry. Every refusal from London made the imagined protector seem more distant. Every act of enforcement made the crown feel less like a guardian and more like the face stamped onto authority. Colonists might still say they loved the king, but their political habits were training them to live without him. That is the quiet movement beneath the louder events. The revolution began not only when colonists rejected George III, but when they built networks of argument and cooperation that made royal approval less necessary. They learned to call meetings, form committees, coordinate boycotts, circulate grievances, and punish those who broke ranks. In defending their rights as British subjects, they created institutions and expectations that pointed beyond Britain. This is why dangerous ideas rarely announce themselves honestly. They do not always enter shouting for independence. Sometimes they arrive dressed as loyalty. They say they want restoration, not rupture. They claim to defend the old order from corruption. And for a while that may be true, but ideas are not obedient servants. Once released into a crisis, they begin to test the walls around them. By the early 1770s, the colonists had not yet become a nation. Many still wanted reconciliation. Many still believed the imperial family could be repaired. Yet the language of liberty had already done something irreversible. It had given ordinary grievances a larger meaning. It had taught scattered colonies to hear their separate complaints as part of one argument. The king remained on the throne across the ocean. But in America, another kind of authority was beginning to form, printed, argued, improvised, and restless. It is easy to make George III too large. American memory, especially after the Declaration of Independence, turned him into the face of everything that had gone wrong. He became the man who taxed without listening, punished without understanding, and answered petitions with soldiers. In the political imagination of rebellion, the king had to become simple. He had to be made visible. Empires are complicated things, but revolutions need a figure they can accuse. The real George III was more difficult. He was not a decorative monarch asleep behind palace doors while ministers casually lost an empire in his name. Nor was he an all-commanding despot, pulling every string with theatrical cruelty. Britain in the 18th century was a constitutional monarchy, not an absolute one. Power moved through parliament, ministries, patronage networks, elections, aristocratic factions, imperial boards, and local officials who often interpreted orders through their own ambitions and fears. The king stood inside that system. He influenced it. He worked through it. He did not simply float above it. That distinction matters because it changes the moral shape of the story. If George III had been a lone tyrant, the American Revolution would be easier to narrate. One wicked ruler, one oppressed people, one inevitable break. But the conflict was not born from personal madness or private malice. It emerged from a political structure in which many people believed they were acting reasonably, even constitutionally, while pushing the empire toward disaster. George III believed in royal authority, but he also believed in law. He valued order, hierarchy, duty, and moral seriousness. He wanted a stable government after years of factional maneuvering. He was not comfortable with the idea that imperial policy should be dictated by colonial pressure. To him, and to many in Britain, backing down too easily could look less like wisdom than surrender. There was a deeper anxiety beneath that view. If Parliament could be defied by colonists across the Atlantic, what did sovereignty mean? If a crowd in Boston or an assembly in Virginia could effectively veto imperial legislation, what held the empire together? To British officials, the question was not only American, it was global. Britain's power rested on credibility. Ireland was watching. The Caribbean was watching. European rivals were watching. The empire's enemies, and even its friends, might interpret compromise as weakness. This is one reason George III's firmness seemed sensible to many around him. He was not simply refusing to listen because he enjoyed conflict. He was defending a vision of empire in which lawful authority had to remain indivisible. Sovereignty, once broken into local exceptions, might never be fully repaired. But America had been built on exceptions. That was the contradiction the king and his ministers struggled to understand. The colonies had long lived within an empire where practical autonomy softened formal dependence. Local assemblies were not sovereign in London's eyes, but they had learned to behave as though their consent mattered deeply. Trade regulations existed, but enforcement had often been uneven. Governors represented royal power, but they depended on local cooperation. The empire worked because many constitutional questions were left blurred. George III's world wanted the blur removed. From a distance, colonial resistance looked like disobedience hiding behind legal cleverness. The colonists spoke endlessly of rights, but refused measures that seemed modest by British standards. They praised the Constitution, but denied Parliament's authority when it became inconvenient. They claimed loyalty, yet organized resistance. To officials in London, this could seem less like principled liberty than a dangerous habit of having things both ways. And sometimes, that criticism touched something real. Colonial arguments were not always perfectly consistent. Many colonists accepted Parliament's power to regulate trade, while denying its power to tax internally, a distinction that made sense to them, but seemed artificial to many in Britain. They invoked liberty while living in societies marked by slavery, dispossession, hierarchy, and exclusion. They condemned distant power while local elites guarded their own. No honest telling of this story should pretend the patriot case was pure, but inconsistency does not make fear imaginary. The colonists' fear was that Parliament's claims, once accepted, would have no clear stopping point. If Americans could be taxed without direct representation, then their assemblies were subordinate in a way that made their old political habits insecure. If soldiers could be used to enforce compliance, then protection could become pressure. If petitions were dismissed as noise, then loyalty itself began to feel like a one-sided bargain. This was the emotional trap into which George III slowly stepped. For years, colonists had separated the king from the policies they hated. Parliament was the offender. Ministers were corrupt. Customs officials were predatory. Royal governors were misleading the crown. Somewhere above the machinery, many hoped, stood a monarch who might still understand them. This hope was politically useful, but also fragile. Every time George III supported firmness, every time he accepted ministerial advice that treated resistance as defiance rather than constitutional alarm, every time the machinery of enforcement moved under his royal authority, that imagined separation narrowed. The king did not need to personally design every measure for Americans to feel that the measures belonged to him. His name appeared on the system. His approval gave it dignity. His refusal to intervene against it made him harder to rescue in their imagination. The king was becoming responsible not because he controlled every detail, but because monarchy concentrates responsibility. A parliament can be abstract. A ministry can change. A customs board can be obscure. But a king has a face. He has a voice in proclamations. He has a portrait on the wall. He is praised in church, toasted in public, printed on official language. When anger seeks a target, monarchy offers one ready-made. This is not unique to George III. It is one of the risks of kingship. The crown can bind a people together by giving the state a human symbol. But when the state begins to feel hostile, that same symbol gathers resentment. A monarch receives loyalty in good weather and blame in the storm. By the early 1770s, colonial anger had not yet fully settled on George III, but the drift had begun. Pamphlets and speeches increasingly treated imperial policy not as a collection of mistakes, but as evidence of design. A design against liberty. A design to reduce the colonies to obedience. Whether such a unified plot truly existed is doubtful. The evidence is stronger for a series of misjudgments, assumptions, pressures, and reactions than for a single master plan. But in politics, a perceived pattern can be almost as powerful as a proven conspiracy. Colonists looked at taxes, troops, customs enforcement, dissolved assemblies, punitive laws, and dismissive responses. They connected the dots. Britain looked at protests, riots, boycotts, smuggling, committees, and open defiance. It connected the dots, too. Each side assembled a portrait of the other from its most alarming features. George III's tragedy was that he did not see how rapidly his symbolic role was changing in America. Or if he saw it, He judged it through the lens of authority rather than affection. He expected loyalty to survive correction. Many colonists expected loyalty to be honored by restraint. The distance between those expectations widened until language itself began to fail. A petition that Americans considered respectful could sound insolent in London. A law that Parliament considered necessary could sound enslaving in Boston. A royal proclamation meant to restore order could read like a declaration of contempt. This is the hidden theater behind the imperial crisis. Not a king alone in a room deciding America's fate, but a monarch standing at the center of a system whose complexity made blame difficult until blame found him. And once blame attached itself to the king, it would not easily detach. For the moment, he remained behind the curtain, active, watchful, convinced of the need for firmness, and still protected by the last habits of colonial loyalty. The colonists had not yet fully turned him into the enemy, but they had begun to wonder whether the protector they imagined had ever truly existed. That suspicion would matter more than any single tax, because subjects can forgive a mistaken policy. They can sometimes forgive a foolish minister. They can even forgive a distant parliament if they believe the sovereign still hears them. But when the king himself seems deaf, loyalty begins to lose its shelter. Boston was not the whole revolution. It only seemed that way sometimes. To British officials, Boston had become a troublesome town, with an unusual talent for making imperial policy difficult. It was crowded, political, argumentative, and closely tied to the sea. Ships arrived with goods, rumors, orders, and resentment. Printers worked quickly. Taverns carried news faster than any official would have liked. Merchants complained. Laborers watched the docks. And local leaders understood that a public mood could become a weapon if handled with care. Boston was not merely a place where events happened. It was a place that interpreted events loudly. By the late 1760s, the presence of British troops had altered the city's atmosphere. Soldiers were visible in streets where they were not wanted, competing for work, enforcing the impression of occupation, even when no one in London would have used that word comfortably. To British authorities, troops helped restore order and support the enforcement of law. To many Bostonians, their presence suggested that Parliament's arguments now came with bayonets. That is the emotional background of the Boston Massacre. The word massacre does powerful work. It suggests a one-sided slaughter, a moral clarity, a scene in which innocence meets brutality. The actual event was messier, more confused, and more humanly dangerous than the name allows. A confrontation formed, a crowd gathered. Insults and objects were thrown. Soldiers, isolated and anxious, stood under pressure. In the confusion, shots were fired. 5 colonists died. That was enough, not because the facts were simple, but because the symbol was irresistible. In a city already primed to see the army as a threat, the blood in King Street seemed to confirm what many had feared. British authority had become coercive, alien, and willing to kill. The details of who provoked whom, who panicked, and what orders were heard or misheard mattered in court. They mattered to justice. But in public memory, an image often outruns a legal record. And Boston had men who understood images. The incident was quickly transformed into propaganda. Engravings, accounts, speeches, and commemorations gave the event a shape that could travel. The scene became less a confused street clash and more a political lesson. British soldiers were shown as instruments of tyranny. The dead became martyrs of liberty. The town became a witness. The empire became a danger that had revealed itself in gunsmoke. This does not mean the outrage was fake. That would be too easy and unfair. 5 people had died. The presence of troops had genuinely inflamed tensions. Colonists had real reasons to fear the use of military power in civil society. But propaganda does not require invention from nothing. Often it begins with a real wound and teaches everyone how to understand it. The Boston Massacre mattered because it converted an argument about authority into an argument about safety. Before blood was spilled, many colonists could still think of imperial power in constitutional terms. Parliament had overstepped. Taxes were unlawful. Assemblies had rights. These were serious claims, but they belonged to the world of petitions and pamphlets. After King Street, the question became more immediate. What happens when an empire sends soldiers among people who do not consent to the policies those soldiers protect? A soldier's musket made Parliament feel closer. It also made the king feel closer, though not in the way monarchy usually desires. The crown, once distant and almost ceremonial in colonial life, now appeared through uniforms, orders, sentries, and force. The symbolic chain was not always fair. George III did not stand in Boston that night. He did not fire into the crowd. He did not manage every decision that placed troops in the city. But imperial authority was increasingly experienced as one connected body. The musket and the monarch began to occupy the same political imagination. That was dangerous for the crown. Still, the aftermath reveals something important about the colonial movement. It was not simply mob anger consuming law. The soldiers were tried. John Adams, no friend of British overreach, helped defend them, insisting that the law must not become a servant of passion. This detail matters because it complicates the myth. Colonial resistance could be fiery, theatrical, and sometimes violent, but its leaders also understood the power of appearing principled. They wanted to show that their cause was not chaos. Adams's defense did not erase the political meaning of the deaths. It sharpened it in an unexpected way. The Patriots could say, in effect, that Americans had given British soldiers a fair trial, while Britain had given America troops in its streets. Whether or not every listener accepted that contrast, it was politically useful. The empire's defenders saw the matter differently. They saw an unruly crowd provoking soldiers who had been placed in an impossible position. They saw Boston radicals turning disorder into martyrdom. They saw local leaders exploiting tragedy to deepen resistance. There was truth here too. Crowds can be frightening. Soldiers under pressure can panic. Political organizers can turn grief into strategy with remarkable speed. The most honest reading has to hold both realities at once. The Boston Massacre was not a planned slaughter by a royal machine. It was also not a meaningless accident. It was the product of an environment made combustible by mistrust, military presence, imperial policy, local defiance, and public fear. When power and resentment share the same narrow streets, very little is needed to make history. A thrown object, a shouted insult, a nervous finger, a flash. Afterward, Boston did not allow the memory to fade. Annual commemorations kept the event alive. Speeches retold the story not merely as mourning, but as instruction. The dead became part of a political calendar. Memory itself became organization. Each retelling reminded listeners that British authority had drawn blood, and each retelling pushed reconciliation a little further away from trust. This is how isolated violence becomes national meaning. Most colonists did not witness the shooting. Many knew only what was printed, repeated, illustrated, or preached. But that was enough. In an age of slow travel and intense rumor, the emotional truth of a story could become more influential than the full complexity of the event. Boston's suffering could be adopted by people far beyond Boston, especially if they already suspected that their own rights were under threat. The empire struggled to answer this kind of politics. It could move troops. It could pass laws. It could repeal laws. It could issue explanations. But it could not easily control the meaning of blood once spilled in public. Official reports might insist on nuance. Patriot printers could offer a picture. Nuance rarely wins quickly against a picture. And yet, the crisis did not immediately become war. War, that is another important restraint in the story. After the massacre, tensions rose, memories hardened, but many people still hoped the empire could step back from the edge. The machinery of protest did not yet require independence. The king was not yet universally condemned as the enemy. The old language of rights within empire still had life in it, but the emotional field had changed. There are moments when a government can still compromise on paper, but has already lost something less visible, the presumption that its power is protective. Once subjects begin to believe that authority is willing to harm them, every later action is read through that suspicion. A tax becomes a threat. A shipload of goods becomes a test. A punishment becomes proof of design. Boston had seen men die under British guns. From London, this could be explained as a tragic consequence of disorder. From Boston, it became evidence of what disorder truly was. Not the crowd in the street, but the empire that had put soldiers there. That disagreement would not heal easily. It remained under the surface, waiting for the next crisis to give it form. Tea was a small thing to carry so much empire inside it. A leaf, dried and packed into chests. A drink poured in polite rooms, merchant houses, taverns, and kitchens. A habit of comfort. A symbol of taste. And then, almost absurdly, a test of sovereignty. By the early 1770s, Britain was not trying to invent a new crisis out of nothing. Officials in London believed they were managing an old problem: how to make colonial resistance submit without appearing to surrender Parliament's authority. The tax on tea was not large. That was precisely why British leaders thought it might work. If the duty remained, Parliament's principle survived. If the tea could be sold cheaply, perhaps colonists would buy it, drink it, and in doing so quietly accept the authority behind it. It was a clever policy in the way clever policies sometimes are. It understood the numbers and misunderstood the people. For many colonists, the issue was not whether tea cost less. The issue was what buying it meant. A lowered price could even make the danger feel sharper, because it suggested that Parliament might seduce obedience rather than demand it openly. The colonists were being asked, in effect, to accept a constitutional claim by enjoying a bargain. There is something almost modern about that. Politics hidden inside consumption, principle tested at the counter. The East India Company added another layer. Britain's great commercial machine needed help, and the tea policy was designed partly to assist it by allowing company tea to reach colonial markets more directly. To imperial planners, this could look practical. To colonial merchants, especially those who had profited through older channels, it looked threatening. To political activists, it looked like a dangerous marriage of corporate privilege and parliamentary power. Again, motives mixed. Some resistance came from principle, some from trade interest, some from fear of monopoly, some from anger at being maneuvered into submission by a commodity many people used every day. The tea crisis mattered because it brought together the constitutional, the economic, and the symbolic in one object. The chest of tea became a document that could be opened, sold, taxed, refused, or destroyed. In several colonies, resistance prevented the tea from being landed or sold. Ships were turned away. Consignees were pressured to resign. Crowds gathered. Committees watched. The political networks developed in earlier crises now showed their usefulness. This was not spontaneous irritation. It was organized vigilance. Boston was different. There, the tea ships remained in harbor while the deadline for action approached. Royal authority, merchant interests, and patriot resistance locked into place. Neither side wanted to concede. The tea could not be unloaded without seeming to defeat the protest movement. It could not simply sail away without humiliating imperial authority. The harbor became a stage on which everyone knew the audience was larger than Massachusetts. Then came the night when men, some disguised in a way later memory would enlarge, boarded the ships and dumped the tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party has been retold so often that it risks becoming quaint. A costume scene, a patriotic postcard, a rebellious prank with salt air around it. But in its own moment, it was a serious destruction of property and a direct attack on imperial policy. The men who did it understood the power of restraint. They targeted the tea, not the ships. They avoided uncontrolled looting. They turned destruction into a message disciplined enough to be legible. That discipline is part of why the event lasted. It was not random riot. It was political theater with a bill attached. From London, however, the message was intolerable. British leaders did not see a noble performance of constitutional resistance. They saw defiance. They saw a town refusing law, intimidating officials, destroying valuable property, and daring the empire to respond. And this time, many in Britain believed response had to be severe. The result was punishment. The measures Americans called the intolerable acts, and Britain called coercive, aimed to bring Massachusetts back under control. Boston's port was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. The colony's government was tightened. Royal authority was strengthened. Provisions were made that colonists feared would protect officials from local accountability. Quartering became more alarming in colonial imagination. The message was blunt. Disorder would have consequences. To British officials, this was restoration. Boston had gone too far, and if the imperial government failed to act, every colony might learn the wrong lesson. Punishment was meant to isolate the radicals, sober the moderate, and demonstrate that Parliament's authority still had teeth. But this is where Britain misread the emotional map of America. The punishment of Boston did not simply frighten the other colonies into obedience. It helped convince them that Boston's cause might become their own. Closing one port could be seen as discipline. It could also be seen as a warning. What had happened to Massachusetts today might happen to Virginia, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, or New York tomorrow. The empire had intended to make an example of Boston. Instead, it made Boston useful to everyone's imagination. That is a crucial turning point. Before this, colonial resistance could still be fragmented by local interest. A tax might irritate merchants more than farmers. A customs dispute might concern ports more than inland settlements. A riot in Boston might look like Boston's problem. But punitive legislation had a way of clarifying the stakes. If Parliament could alter a colony's government and close its harbor as punishment, then the issue was no longer merely tea. It was the security of every colony's rights. The door to reconciliation did not slam shut all at once. History rarely has such neat sound effects. But it narrowed. And the narrowing was psychological as much as political. Trust was being replaced by anticipation of injury. Colonists began watching British actions not as isolated policies, but as parts of a larger design. Britain watched colonial resistance not as complaint, but as rebellion in rehearsal. Each side found the interpretation it feared most, and then behaved in ways that made the other side's fear more plausible. This is one of the bleak mechanics of escalation. If Britain acted mildly, it seemed weak. If Britain acted firmly, it seemed tyrannical. If colonists protested peacefully, they seemed ungrateful. If they resisted forcefully, they seemed rebellious. The space for moderate action shrank because each side judged the other's motives through accumulated suspicion. The coercive acts also changed the role of sympathy. Other colonies sent aid to Boston. Food, supplies, and expressions of support crossed colonial boundaries. This was practical relief, but it was also political education. People who had never seen Boston Harbor could now imagine themselves connected to its suffering. Shared grievance became a kind of geography. The empire's attempt to isolate Massachusetts helped draw a rough outline around a continental cause. That did not mean unity was easy. It never was. Some colonists thought Boston had gone too far. Loyalists saw the destruction of tea as lawless and the punishment as regrettable, but understandable. Merchants feared instability. Farmers had local concerns. Enslaved people and native nations watched a dispute over liberty conducted by men who often denied liberty or land to others. The crisis contained contradictions that later memory would sometimes polish away. But political momentum rarely waits for moral consistency. By punishing Boston, Britain forced colonists to decide whether imperial authority could be trusted to discipline one community without endangering all. The answer, increasingly, was no. The old habit of appealing to the king still survived, but it was weakening. If the crown approved or tolerated these punishments, then what exactly was left of the king as protector? Tea had begun as a commodity. It became a test. The test became destruction. Destruction became punishment. And punishment did something London did not intend. It made separate colonies look at one another and recognize a shared vulnerability. That was the closing door, not independence yet, not war yet, but a shift in posture. The colonists were no longer only resisting policies they disliked. They were preparing to defend a political world they feared Britain was willing to dismantle. In the harbor, the tea dissolved into salt water. On land, the consequences hardened. The British Empire did not think it was losing America. Not at first. From London, the colonial crisis often appeared smaller than it really was. Not harmless, exactly. Not pleasant, but manageable. A noisy minority. A difficult port town. A few ambitious lawyers. A cluster of merchants protecting their profits. A set of assemblies enjoying their own importance a little too much. If authority remained firm, surely the fever would pass. That assumption may have been one of Britain's most costly mistakes. It was not that British officials knew nothing about the colonies. Reports crossed the Atlantic. Governors wrote letters. Customs officers complained. Military commanders sent assessments. Loyalists warned of disorder. Merchants described trade disruptions. Parliament debated American affairs with intensity. London was not blind in the simple sense. The problem was not absence of information. It was interpretation. Every empire receives news through filters. The filter of distance. The filter of class. The filter of pride. The filter of officials who do not want to admit failure. The filter of frightened loyalists who may exaggerate radical influence. The filter of ministers who need events to fit a policy already chosen. By the time American resistance reached the minds of British decision-makers, it had often been translated into something easier to dismiss. A constitutional movement became faction. A continental anxiety became local disorder. A widening political culture became manipulation by a few dangerous men. There was comfort in that reading. If the trouble came from radicals, then ordinary colonists might still be loyal. If ordinary colonists were still loyal, then firmness could isolate the agitators. If firmness isolated the agitators, then the empire could be restored without conceding the central question of parliamentary authority. This was the logic of control. But America was becoming harder to divide in the way Britain hoped. The colonies were still different from one another, deeply so. Massachusetts was not Virginia. Pennsylvania was not South Carolina. Port towns did not think like backcountry settlements. Religious dissenters, Anglican elites, merchants, planters, artisans, farmers, enslaved people, and native nations all occupied different worlds of interest and fear. Anyone who imagines the 13 colonies as one united patriotic body from the beginning is reading backward from the ending. Yet political unity does not require sameness. It requires a shared threat. The coercive acts helped provide one. Britain believed it was punishing Massachusetts. Many colonists saw a model of what imperial power might do elsewhere. This was not because every colony loved Boston. Some did not. Boston could be irritating even to people who agreed with it. But punishment has a way of making even an irritating neighbor look important. The issue became less whether Boston had behaved wisely, and more whether Britain could be trusted with the power it claimed. Here, pride worked on both sides. British pride had been built by victory. The empire had defeated France, expanded its reach, and stood as one of the great powers of the age, to be challenged by its own colonists, people whom many in Britain considered dependent, provincial, and protected by British strength, felt like an insult to order itself. Concession could look like humiliation. Colonial pride had been built by experience. Americans had raised assemblies, managed local taxes, defended frontiers, built towns, printed newspapers, traded across oceans, and argued law as inheritors of English rights. To be treated as children after generations of practical autonomy felt like humiliation of another kind. That is why the phrase, "the empire misreads its children," is so revealing. Britain did see the colonies as part of a political family, but often as junior members of it. Disobedient children could be corrected. They could be punished for their own good. They could be expected to return to affection once discipline had restored the proper hierarchy, but the colonies were no longer children in their own minds. They had grown under the shelter of empire, yes. They had benefited from British naval power and trade. They had also grown used to deciding many things for themselves. When Britain tried to tighten authority after the war, it discovered that dependence had not produced submissiveness. It had produced expectation. Expectation is a difficult thing to govern once disappointed. On the American side, there were misreadings too. Many colonists imagined British policy as more unified and sinister than it may actually have been. They saw design where there was sometimes confusion, ambition, political pressure, financial necessity, bureaucratic habit, and fear of losing control. They suspected a deliberate plan to enslave them, a word they often used with striking moral force even while slavery itself remained brutally present in colonial society. That contradiction should not be ignored. When many patriot writers spoke of enslavement, they meant political subjection. Their language was powerful, but it existed in societies where actual enslaved people had little reason to romanticize colonial liberty. This does not make the constitutional dispute meaningless. It makes the moral landscape more complicated. The colonists could be right to fear arbitrary power from Britain and still blind to the arbitrary power they held over others. The empire, for its part, also misunderstood the emotional depth of colonial constitutional language. British officials heard phrases like rights and liberty and sometimes dismissed them as decoration around self-interest. But those words had become part of how colonists explained themselves to themselves. A movement becomes stronger when people believe their private grievances belong to a public principle. By the time London realized this, the language had already spread. Committees of correspondence linked communities. Local meetings debated imperial policy. Newspapers circulated arguments and warnings. Sermons gave the crisis moral weight. Merchants made economic resistance visible. Women participated through household consumption and boycott culture, even where formal politics excluded them. Crowds enforced community standards, sometimes harshly. The movement's strength was not only in famous leaders, it was in repetition, countless local acts that made resistance feel normal. That normality frightened loyalists, and loyalists are essential to this story, because they remind us that Britain was not foolish to believe it still had friends in America. Many colonists remained loyal to the crown. Some feared mob rule. Some depended on imperial office or trade. Some believed Parliament had authority. Some disliked British policy, but dreaded rebellion more. Some simply saw no good end to defying the greatest empire of the age. Their existence encouraged British confidence. If loyalists were numerous, then perhaps resistance could be broken by pressure. If radicals could be separated from the moderate majority, then the king's government might restore order. If one decisive move demonstrated imperial resolve, perhaps the silent loyal would step forward. But silence is politically ambiguous. A person who remains quiet may be loyal, or afraid, or undecided, or waiting to see who wins. Britain often interpreted quiet as support. Patriots often interpreted quiet as consent waiting to be awakened. Both sides were guessing, and the guesses mattered. The Atlantic made all of this worse. Distance slowed correction. A policy could be designed in London based on reports already out of date. Colonial reaction could arrive months later, by which time ministers had defended their decision publicly and could not easily retreat. Rumor filled the gaps. News arrived in fragments. Each side imagined the other through delay. In that delay, suspicion had room to grow. There is a particular kind of imperial arrogance that does not look like cruelty from inside the imperial capital. It looks like confidence. Confidence that local anger is temporary. Confidence that authority, once asserted, will be accepted. Confidence that people who have long belonged to an empire cannot truly imagine leaving it. That last confidence was the most dangerous. Because Americans were beginning to imagine exactly that, even if many still refused to say it plainly. Not independence as a settled program. Not yet. But a future in which local rights might have to be defended against imperial authority by more than petitions. A future in which colonies might coordinate without waiting for permission. A future in which the king's protection could no longer be assumed. Britain misread this as posture. In some cases, it was posture. Political movements do posture. They threaten more than they are ready to do. They dramatize injury. They speak in absolutes while hoping for negotiation. But a posture repeated under pressure can become a position. A position defended in public can become identity, and identity, once formed around resistance, is very hard to command back into obedience. The tragedy is that there were still people on both sides who wanted compromise. There were still colonists who hoped for restored harmony. There were still Britons who thought conciliation wiser than coercion. But the center was weakening. Each new measure made moderation look naive. Each new protest made firmness look necessary. Each side strengthened the very people on the other side it most feared. London believed it was facing disorder that could be corrected. America increasingly believed it was facing power that had to be resisted. Between correction and resistance, there is almost no common language. And so the empire moved forward, not because war was inevitable in some grand sense, but because too many people with authority mistook warning signs for noise. They saw smoke and blamed the weather. They heard cracks and called them complaints. They watched colonies begin to move together and told themselves the movement was shallow. It was not shallow. It had roots now, in memory, in print, in assemblies, in fear, in pride, in local institutions, and in the growing suspicion that Britain would never understand America until America made itself impossible to ignore. There is a point in every imperial crisis when words begin to arrive armed, not because everyone has stopped speaking. In fact, people often speak more intensely just before violence begins. They pass resolutions, send petitions, publish essays, appoint committees, gather in congresses, and choose phrases with great care. They argue over legality as if legality itself can hold the line. But beneath the language, another preparation begins. Powder is stored. Militias drill. Roads are watched. Messengers ride with greater urgency. Men who still call themselves loyal subjects begin to ask where the muskets are kept. This was the world of the First Continental Congress. When delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1774, they did not arrive as representatives of a new nation. That is important. The United States did not yet exist, except perhaps as a nervous possibility in the minds of a few people willing to think farther than most. The delegates came from colonies with separate histories, separate interests, and separate fears. Some wanted firm resistance, some wanted reconciliation, some wanted to preserve imperial ties by forcing Britain to respect colonial rights. Some were cautious because they understood that once a people step beyond petition, there may be no dignified way to step back. The Congress was not a revolutionary government in the full sense. It was an emergency conversation that discovered it had power. That power came from coordination. The delegates approved a continental association to enforce a boycott of British goods. They set out grievances. They asserted rights. They encouraged local committees to monitor compliance. This was not war, but it was not ordinary protest either. It created machinery outside the normal imperial structure. It asked colonists to obey a collective American decision rather than wait for royal permission or parliamentary approval. That was a profound change. A boycott may sound less dramatic than a battle, but it can rearrange authority quietly. Who decides what is honorable to buy? Who watches the merchant who breaks the agreement? Who punishes the neighbor who refuses to cooperate? Who speaks for the community when official government is distrusted? In town after town, committees became practical expressions of resistance. They made the imperial crisis local, personal, and daily. Britain saw these developments with alarm and not without reason. From the imperial point of view, the colonies were no longer merely complaining. They were building alternative systems of obedience. A subject who petitions still recognizes the authority above him. A subject who organizes enforcement against imperial policy begins to act as though authority has already shifted. This is the dangerous middle ground. Not yet independence, but no longer submission. In Massachusetts, the ground was especially tense. After the punitive measures against Boston and the reorganization of colonial government, many colonists believed ordinary constitutional protections had been violated. Local militias began to prepare more seriously. The term Minutemen captures some of that urgency. Men ready to move quickly, not as a professional army, but as a community defense network. It was improvisational, uneven, and imperfect. But it showed that political resistance had begun to acquire a military body. General Thomas Gage, the royal governor and military commander in Massachusetts, stood in a nearly impossible position. He had to restore authority without provoking a wider war, enforce policy without enough trust, and interpret a countryside where almost every movement could be watched, reported, and exaggerated. He was not a cartoon villain. He was an imperial officer trying to govern a society that increasingly refused to be governed on imperial terms. The British government wanted colonial resistance broken. But breaking resistance required action. Action risked bloodshed. Bloodshed might confirm everything the resistance had been saying. This was the trap closing around both sides. In April 1775, British troops moved from Boston toward Concord, where colonial military supplies were believed to be stored. Their march was meant to be decisive, practical, perhaps even limited. Seize arms. assert authority, prevent rebellion from becoming more dangerous. In the language of imperial administration, such a move could be described with calm verbs. But people do not hear marching troops as calm verbs. Riders spread the alarm. Bells rang. Men woke in the dark and reached for weapons. Roads that had seemed ordinary by daylight became lines of decision. The countryside listened, moved, and gathered. At Lexington, British troops and colonial militia faced one another before sunrise. The men on the green were not yet soldiers of an independent republic. They were local militiamen standing under immense uncertainty. The British regulars were not monsters. They were disciplined troops carrying out orders in hostile country. Both sides were afraid. Both sides were armed. Both sides stood inside stories that told them the other was dangerous. Then a shot was fired. The exact source of that first shot remains uncertain. That uncertainty is not a minor footnote. It is part of the event's meaning. Revolutions often begin in ambiguity. Later memory wants a clean beginning, a responsible hand, a single moral spark. History often gives us smoke, confusion, shouted orders, nervous men, and witnesses whose accounts do not settle everything. What we can say with confidence is that shots followed, men fell, and the argument had changed. At Concord, the confrontation widened. Colonial militia gathered in greater numbers. British troops, having searched for supplies, began the hard march back toward Boston under persistent fire from militia along the road. Stone walls, fields, trees, and bends in the road became part of the fighting. The British soldiers suffered heavily during the retreat. The countryside that imperial power had hoped to discipline had become hostile ground. This was not yet a declaration of independence. That point matters, because violence did not instantly create political clarity. Many colonists still hoped that the fighting might force Britain to negotiate. Some believed they were defending themselves against unlawful military action while remaining loyal to the crown. The old mental world did not vanish in one morning. People can fire at a king's soldiers and still hesitate to say they have rejected the king. Human beings are more contradictory than slogans allow. But Lexington and Concord made contradiction harder to sustain. Once blood had been shed, each side had martyrs, grievances, and proof. Britain could say rebellion had moved from words to arms. The colonists could say British troops had marched against them and drawn blood. The dispute could still be explained in constitutional language, but the language now had graves behind it. The siege of Boston followed. Militia forces gathered around the city, containing British troops within it. The image is striking. Imperial soldiers held in a colonial port by men who only months earlier had been farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, and local militiamen. The British Army remained formidable, professional, and dangerous. No serious observer could assume it would be easily defeated. But the political meaning of the siege was unmistakable. The empire had lost normal control over a portion of its own territory. And still, the colonists kept speaking. The Second Continental Congress would soon meet. Petitions would still be considered. Armies would be organized. Commanders would be chosen. Even after violence began, Americans did not move in perfect unity toward independence. The middle ground remained crowded, though shrinking. It contained men who wanted rights restored, not empire destroyed. It contained moderates who feared both British coercion and popular radicalism. It contained loyalists who saw disaster coming and could not persuade their neighbors to turn back. War does not always begin when everyone decides they want war. Sometimes it begins when enough people prepare for the possibility that the possibility becomes real. The deeper tragedy of Lexington and Concord is that both sides could interpret the same events as defensive. British authorities were defending law and seizing military stores before rebellion grew. Colonial militia were defending their communities from troops sent to impose unconstitutional power. Each side believed it was responding to the other's escalation. Neither side saw itself as the aggressor in the way its enemies did. This mutual innocence is one of the most dangerous emotions in history. When both sides believe they are acting defensively, violence can feel morally necessary. Restraint begins to look like surrender. Compromise begins to look like betrayal. Every casualty becomes not a reason to stop, but a reason to continue. The king across the ocean was still not universally hated in America, but his soldiers had marched. His authority had been invoked. His government had treated resistance as rebellion, and for many colonists, the old hope that the crown might stand apart from the conflict became harder to defend. A petition could cross the Atlantic, so could an army. But after Lexington and Concord, neither would arrive in the same world that had sent it. For years, many colonists had preserved one last door in their imagination. Behind that door stood the king. Parliament might be corrupt. Ministers might be arrogant. Customs officials might be greedy. Governors might be misleading London. Soldiers might be acting under bad orders. But George III, they hoped, could still be appealed to as a fatherly figure above the machinery of conflict. The crown, in this version of the empire, was not the source of oppression. It was the place where justice might finally be restored. That hope had always required a certain emotional discipline. The colonists had to separate the king from the government that acted in his name. They had to believe that petitions could reach him cleanly, without being twisted by ministers or filtered by imperial pride. They had to imagine that if he truly understood their loyalty, their grievances, and their constitutional fears, he would protect them from Parliament's overreach. It was a comforting belief because it allowed resistance to remain loyal. But after blood had been shed, comfort became harder to maintain. The fighting at Lexington and Concord did not immediately produce independence. It produced shock, anger, fear, and a desperate search for meaning. Colonial leaders still faced a delicate problem. They needed to organize military resistance without pushing every moderate into loyalist arms. They needed to explain why men were taking up arms against royal troops while still insisting, in many cases, that they were not rejecting the monarch himself. This was not merely political caution. It reflected genuine uncertainty. Many colonists had been raised inside a world where monarchy felt natural. The king was present in prayers, oaths, legal forms, and public rituals. To reject him was not like changing a policy preference. It meant severing a sacred and political bond that had framed life for generations. Even angry men could hesitate before crossing that line. So the colonies continued to speak in two voices. One voice prepared for war. The other pleaded for reconciliation. The most famous expression of that second voice was the Olive Branch Petition. It asked George III to intervene, to help restore harmony, to recognize that the colonists were not seeking separation, but relief from measures they believed unlawful. Its tone was deferential, almost painfully so when read beside the military preparations already underway. That contradiction was not accidental. It was the sound of a political world trying to keep two futures alive at once. But the king was moving toward a different conclusion. From his perspective, armed resistance had changed the issue. The colonists were no longer simply petitioning. They had opposed royal troops in the field. They were organizing armed forces. They were challenging the state's authority not only in pamphlets and assemblies, but with muskets. To George III and many in Britain, this looked like rebellion, whatever respectful language accompanied it. The proclamation of rebellion made that judgment unmistakable. Its significance was not only legal or military, it was emotional. It told Americans who still imagined themselves as loyal petitioners that the king did not accept their self-description. They might claim to be defending British liberty. He saw subjects in open defiance. They might call their resistance constitutional. He saw rebellion. Once that royal judgment became clear, the last protective fiction began to collapse. This is one of the most painful transitions in the imperial break. People can endure being misunderstood by enemies. It is harder to endure being misunderstood by someone they had cast as protector. The colonists had appealed upward, and the answer from above was not rescue. It was condemnation. Not every colonist interpreted this the same way. Loyalists saw the king's firmness as proper and necessary. To them, the colonies had gone too far. Armed resistance was not a constitutional argument. It was disorder dressed in legal language. Many loyalists believed that if rebellion succeeded, society itself might unravel. Property threatened, hierarchy overturned, crowds empowered, and war brought into homes that had asked for none of it. Their fear was not imaginary. Revolutions do disrupt. They do punish dissent. They do turn neighbors into informants, enemies, refugees, and sometimes targets. Loyalists understood something that romantic memory often softens. Rebellion is not only a noble idea, it is a social earthquake. But for many patriots, the king's rejection of their petitions proved the opposite lesson. It suggested that peaceful appeals had been exhausted. If the monarch would not hear them, then loyalty had become a chain rather than a bond. If the king treated them as rebels while they still called themselves subjects, then perhaps the title of subject no longer protected anything. This was the moment George III began to change in American political language. He was no longer merely distant. He became implicated. Pamphleteers and speakers increasingly connected him to the pattern of imperial coercion. Troops, rejected petitions, punitive measures, the refusal to compromise. The shift did not happen evenly everywhere, and it did not persuade everyone, but the direction was clear. The king who had once been imagined as a shield against Parliament was being recast as the head of the system Americans feared. The process required emotional work. A people do not abandon monarchy simply because a document tells them to. They need a new story that makes abandonment morally possible. The patriots had to teach themselves and their neighbors that resistance to the king was not treason against lawful authority, but defense against authority that had betrayed its purpose. They had to transform obedience from virtue into danger. That is a profound psychological reversal. It helps explain why colonial writers became increasingly severe in their descriptions of George III. The harsher the break, the stronger the justification needed to be. If Americans were to take up arms permanently against the crown had to be shown not as mistaken, but as hostile. Not badly advised, but morally responsible. Not a father misled by ministers, but a ruler who had chosen power over justice. Was this portrait fair? Only partly. George III did support firm measures. He did view the resistance as rebellion. He did not become the mediator many colonists hoped he would be. But the patriot image of him as a singular tyrant compressed a much larger imperial crisis into one person. It simplified parliament, ministers, colonial divisions, economic interests, and decades of constitutional ambiguity. That simplification was politically useful. It also became historically powerful. Revolution often works this way. It turns systems into faces. A system is hard to hate. It has committees, procedures, offices, excuses, delays, and shared responsibility. A king can be named. A king can be accused. A king can be rejected. The crown's symbolic strength now became its weakness. For years, it had helped unify the empire by giving loyalty a human center. Now that same human center gave rebellion a target. Every grievance could be gathered and laid before the throne, not as a petition, but as an indictment. And George III, by refusing to appear as the rescuing father, allowed that indictment to grow. There was still a space, even now, for uncertainty. Some colonists remained loyal. Some wavered. Some hoped for negotiated settlement. Some feared the consequences of independence more than the dangers of submission. But the emotional shelter of monarchy had been damaged beyond easy repair. Once subjects begin to believe that the king has chosen to be their enemy, obedience becomes something different. It no longer feels like loyalty. It feels like surrender. The American cause had not yet fully declared what it was becoming, but it had found something it could no longer be. A protest movement waiting patiently for royal rescue. The king across the ocean had answered, and the answer had hardened the argument. From that point forward, every appeal to liberty carried a quieter implication. If liberty and monarchy could no longer be reconciled, one of them would have to be abandoned. The Declaration of Independence did more than announce separation. It put the king on trial, not in a courtroom, and not before a judge, but before what its authors called the opinions of mankind. That phrase matters. The Declaration was not written only for the people already convinced in America. It was written for the undecided, for foreign powers, for future generations, and perhaps also for the writers themselves. Because once a people breaks from a king, they must explain why the break is not merely useful, but just. The document had to turn rebellion into necessity. That was not a small task. Only a year earlier, many colonists had still been petitioning George III as if he might rescue the empire from its own mistakes. Now the Continental Congress needed to say, clearly and publicly, that the king was not the solution, he was the problem. The old emotional architecture had to be demolished in writing. So the Declaration begins with broad principle. It speaks of equality, rights, consent, and the right of a people to alter or abolish a government that becomes destructive of its proper ends. Those ideas have traveled so far since 1776 that they can sound almost inevitable now, as if they had always belonged at the center of American identity. But in their moment, they were not merely inspirational, they were dangerous. They offered a theory by which monarchy itself could be judged, and if found wanting, rejected. Then the document narrows. After the philosophical opening, it becomes an indictment, a list of grievances, a record of accusation. And the accused is not the British system, not Parliament, not the ministry, not imperial policy in the abstract. The accused is he. That repeated pronoun does remarkable political work. It gathers years of conflict and assigns them to a single figure. He has refused laws. He has dissolved representative houses. He has obstructed justice. He has kept armies among the people. He has cut off trade. He has imposed taxes without consent. He has waged war against them. The rhythm is deliberate, almost prosecutorial. Each grievance adds weight to the charge that George III has become a ruler unfit for free people. Was every accusation fair in the simple personal sense? That is where careful history must slow down. George III did not personally invent every policy listed. He did not act alone. Parliament, ministers, imperial administrators, colonial governors, military commanders, commercial pressures, and the wider constitutional structure all shaped the crisis. Some grievances compressed complicated events into sharp political language. Some shifted responsibility from institutions onto the monarch because the document needed a clear target. The Declaration is a work of argument, not a neutral archive. But that does not make it dishonest in its own context. The Declaration was trying to explain why reconciliation had failed. It was trying to show that the king, whether by action or refusal, had become inseparable from the coercive power Americans opposed. In a monarchy, responsibility naturally climbs toward the throne. If the king's name gives legitimacy to government, then the king's name also attracts blame when that government is judged destructive. The Declaration exploited that logic with great skill. It transformed George III from distant sovereign into active oppressor. It took a constitutional dispute that had once been full of technical distinctions, internal versus external taxation, representation versus virtual representation, parliamentary authority versus colonial charters, and recast it as a moral drama about power and rights. That shift was necessary because independence required more than legal argument. It required emotional permission. People needed to feel that leaving was not betrayal. The Declaration gave them language for that feeling. It said, in effect, "We did not abandon the king. The king abandoned the purpose of government. We did not seek chaos, we sought rights. We did not rush to separation. We petitioned, warned, endured, and were answered with injury." Whether every colonist accepted that version is another matter. Loyalists did not. Many saw the Declaration as reckless, exaggerated, and treasonous. Some believed the grievances were real but did not justify independence. Others feared that the cure would be worse than the disease. Those objections were not trivial. Independence meant war on a more frightening scale. It meant rejecting the protection of the most powerful empire in the Atlantic world. It meant risking property, life, social order, and uncertain alliances. It meant that failure would not be remembered as a spirited protest. It would be punished as rebellion. The declaration, therefore, that had to harden uncertainty into commitment. This is one reason its accusation against George III is so forceful. The more dangerous the leap, the stronger the moral ground had to appear beneath it. A mild complaint could not support separation. A technical dispute could not inspire armies. A list of administrative frustrations could not persuade foreign courts to take the American cause seriously. The king had to be presented as a ruler who had broken the bond beyond repair, and in doing so, the document changed the meaning of the war. Before July 1776, armed resistance could still be described by some as a defense of rights within the empire. After the declaration, the conflict became something else, a war for independent nationhood. Not every person's heart changed overnight. Not every community suddenly agreed. But the public position had shifted. There would be no simple return to the old imperial family after this. Words had closed the bridge behind them. The declaration also did something larger than its immediate political purpose. It turned the American crisis into a universal claim, at least in language. It did not say merely that these colonies had a special charter dispute with Britain. It said governments derive just powers from consent. It said rights are not gifts from kings. It said legitimacy can be measured against human liberty. That universal language gave the document power. It also exposed its contradictions. The same world that declared equality contained slavery. The same political culture that spoke of consent excluded many from formal political power. Native nations were treated in ways that reveal the limits and prejudices of the revolutionary imagination. Women, enslaved people, free black communities, poor laborers, and loyalists all stood in complicated relation to a freedom claimed in the name of the people. This does not make the declaration meaningless. It makes it unstable in the most historically important sense. Its words exceeded the society that produced them. They could be used by people the original political leadership did not intend to empower. That is one reason the document continued to matter long after the war. It contained promises larger than its author's immediate practice. But in 1776, its immediate purpose was survival through justification. Congress needed unity. It needed legitimacy. It needed foreign recognition, especially from enemies of Britain who would not risk support for a rebellion that looked merely provincial. It needed to tell soldiers and civilians what the war was now for. The declaration gave the struggle a new center of gravity, and at that center stood the accusation against the king. George III had become the necessary villain of the American story, not because he alone caused the revolution, but because the revolution needed a personification of the system it rejected. The Declaration's brilliance was to understand that a monarchy could be undone through the very symbolism that sustained it. If loyalty had once gathered around the crown, then rebellion could gather around the rejection of the crown. The document did not describe every complexity of empire. It was not designed to. It was designed to persuade, to justify, to commit, and to make retreat morally difficult. In that sense, it succeeded with extraordinary force. It took a long, tangled imperial argument and gave it a hard edge. After years of petitions, protests, boycotts, bloodshed, and hesitation, it finally said what could no longer be avoided. The king was not merely mistaken. He was accused, and once the accusation was made before the world, The colonies could no longer claim they were only seeking to be heard. They were seeking to be free. Britain entered the war with every reason to believe it could win. It had a professional army. It had the most powerful navy in the world. It had money, credit, commanders, ports, experience, and an empire-wide system of supply. It had loyal subjects in America who opposed rebellion. It had the confidence of a state that had recently defeated France in a global war. On paper, the contest looked unequal, and on paper, Britain was formidable. The problem was that America was not paper. It was forests, rivers, bad roads, long coastlines, scattered farms, stubborn towns, uncertain weather, and a population that did not need to defeat Britain everywhere in order to survive. The British had to restore authority. The Americans had to make restoration too expensive, too slow, and too politically exhausting to continue forever. Those are very different wars. For Britain, the military challenge was tied to a political illusion. Many officials believed that if the king's forces struck hard enough, occupied key cities, and protected loyalists, the rebellion would collapse from within. The radical leadership would be exposed as a minority. Loyal Americans would rally. Ordinary people, frightened by war and reassured by imperial strength, would return to obedience. There was logic in this. Loyalists did exist, and in significant numbers. Many Americans feared independence, disliked the Continental Congress, distrusted local committees, or simply wanted order. Some enslaved people saw British lines as a possible path away from rebel masters. Some native nations judged British alliance as the better way to resist colonial expansion. The American side was not a single united people marching in one direction. But loyalism was not the simple key Britain hoped it would be. A loyalist population is useful only if it can be protected. To declare loyalty in an area the British Army could not hold was dangerous. Neighbors remembered. Patriot committees punished. Property could be seized. Families could be driven out. A person might prefer the king in private and still remain silent in public because the king's soldiers were 30 miles away and local patriots were at the door. Britain often mistook potential support for usable power. That difference mattered everywhere. The British could capture cities. New York fell and became a major base. Philadelphia, the symbolic seat of Congress, could be occupied. Ports could be threatened or controlled. The Navy could move troops along the coast with a flexibility the Americans could not match. British regulars could defeat Continental troops in set battles, sometimes with painful ease. But occupation was not the same as submission. A city could be held while the countryside remained hostile. A capital could be taken while the rebel government moved. A battlefield victory could scatter an American army without destroying the political cause that sustained it. Britain was fighting not only soldiers, but a web of local resistance, improvised governments, militia networks, and a geography that punished every assumption of quick victory. The Atlantic multiplied every problem. Orders, reinforcements, supplies, and political instructions had to cross an ocean. A decision made in London could be outdated by the time it reached a commander in America. A commander's report could arrive in Britain after the situation had already changed. Horses, food, ammunition, clothing, medicine, and pay had to be managed across long distances. Even success required transport garrisons, and constant attention. The British Navy ruled the sea, but it could not make the continent smaller. Nor could it solve the political contradiction at the heart of the war. Britain was trying to fight rebels without completely destroying the society it hoped to reclaim. Too much harshness could drive neutrals toward the patriot cause. Too much leniency could encourage continued resistance. Punishment had to be strong enough to intimidate, but not so brutal that reconciliation became impossible. That balance is difficult in any civil conflict. Across an ocean, with unreliable intelligence and local vendettas, it became nearly impossible. The American side had its own weaknesses. The Continental Army was often short of supplies, money, clothing, food, and reliable enlistments. Congress struggled to finance the war. State governments guarded their own interests. Militias could be useful one month and absent the next. Disease, desertion, hunger, and fatigue were as much a part of the war as musket fire. The patriotic cause survived not because it was efficient, but because it endured. That endurance is easy to underestimate. British strategy often sought decisive moments. Capture a city, defeat an army, split New England from the other colonies, rally loyalists in the South, force Congress to negotiate. Some of these plans were sensible in theory. But the rebellion did not depend on one city, one road, one port, or one leader alone. Its center was diffuse. That made it disorderly, frustrating, and hard to command, but also hard to kill. George Washington's importance lay partly in understanding this. He did not need to win every battle. He needed to keep an army alive as a symbol and instrument of resistance. As long as the Continental Army existed, the Declaration was not merely a document. It had a body in the field. Even after defeats, even after retreats, even after winter suffering, its survival told Britain that the rebellion still had a military heart. For Britain, this was maddening. A conventional empire wanted a conventional victory. It wanted the enemy army crushed, the major towns secured, the loyal population awakened, and the political rebellion discredited. Instead, the war kept changing shape. When British forces concentrated in one region, resistance persisted elsewhere. When they won battles, they still had to hold ground. When they held ground, they needed supplies. When they sought loyalist help, they discovered that local civil conflict could be as violent and complicated as war against an external enemy. The Southern strategy revealed this especially clearly. British leaders believed the South contained deep loyalist strength. There was some truth to that. But the region also contained fierce patriot resistance, brutal local conflict, and the explosive politics of slavery and frontier warfare. British victories in the South could be impressive, but they did not automatically produce stable control. Loyalist and patriot violence fed on each other. The more the war became local, the less it behaved like an imperial restoration. War in America became a test of political patience. Could Britain keep spending money, men, and attention long enough to wear down the rebellion? Could Americans suffer enough defeats and hardship without giving up? Could loyalists be mobilized before patriots punished them into silence or flight? Could British commanders coordinate across vast distances while ministers in London defended the war against criticism at home? Every answer became less certain with time, and George III remained committed. To him, this was not a minor colonial dispute. It was a rebellion that challenged the authority of Crown and Parliament. If the colonies succeeded, The consequences might ripple through the empire. Firmness was not only pride, it was principle. Yet principle can become a costly prison when events no longer obey the theory behind it. The king and his supporters believed they were holding the empire together. But the act of holding became destructive. The longer the war lasted, the more American identity hardened. The more Britain used force, the more the Patriot case gained emotional evidence. The more loyalists suffered, the less likely reconciliation became. The more cities Britain occupied, the more it discovered that the country around those cities could remain unconquered. This is the paradox of Britain's strength. Its power was immense, but not perfectly suited to the task it had set itself. Naval power could blockade, transport, and strike. It could not easily persuade. Professional armies could seize ground. They could not rebuild trust by marching through hostile towns. Imperial authority could proclaim rebellion. It could not make colonists feel like children again. By the later years of the war, Britain was still dangerous. It could still win battles, still devastate regions, still command fear. No one living through the conflict could know with certainty that independence would survive. But the original hope that America could be restored by a limited display of power and loyalist support had been badly wounded. The empire had expected rebellion to behave like a fire that could be smothered. Instead, it behaved more like a tide. Push it back in one place, and it returned through another channel. Hold the harbor, and it moved inland. Defeat the army, and it reformed. Punish a town, and another colony took warning. The war Britain fought was not the war Britain had imagined. And that gap between imperial expectation and American reality widened with every campaign. Britain could fight the Americans. It could not easily fight the world. That, in the end, was one of the great strategic transformations of the Revolution. What began as a rebellion inside the British Empire became part of a wider imperial war. The conflict expanded beyond the forests, farms, rivers, and ports of North America. It reached the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, India, and the calculations of European courts that had never loved Britain's rise. The American cause did not survive by courage alone. That may sound unromantic, but it is necessary. The Continental Army endured. Local militias resisted. Political leaders improvised under pressure. Ordinary people bore hunger, fear, inflation, divided loyalties, and the violence of a civil conflict. All of that mattered. But Britain's grip weakened decisively when the rebellion ceased to be a problem Britain could isolate. France changed the war. For France, support for the Americans was not simply an act of affection for liberty. There were French thinkers and officers who admired the language of American rights, and some would later carry dangerous expectations back across the Atlantic. But at the level of state policy, France saw opportunity. Britain had humiliated France in the 7 Years' War. British power had expanded across oceans. A rebellion in America offered a chance to weaken an old rival, recover prestige, and disrupt the imperial balance. This was the cold arithmetic behind the romance. The Americans needed France, and France needed Britain distracted. The alliance brought money, supplies, troops, naval power, and diplomatic legitimacy. It told the world that the United States was not merely a collection of rebellious colonies hoping not to be crushed. It had become a recognized partner of a major European power. That recognition changed the psychological weight of the conflict. Britain was no longer suppressing an internal disturbance. It was fighting a war in which American independence had become tied to French strategy. The sea became more dangerous. Before French intervention, British naval strength had been a central pillar of imperial confidence. The Royal Navy could move troops, supply armies, blockade ports, and connect distant theaters. It made the Atlantic an imperial highway. But once France entered the war, and later when Spain joined against Britain, that highway became contested. Britain had to protect its own coasts, guard the Caribbean sugar islands, defend possessions elsewhere, watch European rivals, and still continue operations in North America. The empire's attention fractured. This is one of the reasons the American Revolution cannot be understood only by following the Continental Army from battle to battle. The war's outcome depended on places many Americans never saw. Caribbean islands whose sugar wealth mattered enormously to European empires. Sea lanes where convoys could be captured or protected. Diplomatic rooms where recognition and alliance were weighed. Imperial outposts whose defense pulled resources owing from the rebellion. Britain had immense strength, but that strength was now dispersed. An empire is powerful because it reaches everywhere. In war, that can become a weakness, because everywhere must be defended. The Caribbean was especially important. To modern memory, the 13 colonies often dominate the story because they became the United States. But to 18th century imperial planners, the sugar islands were extraordinarily valuable. Their economies were brutal, dependent on enslaved labor, and deeply profitable. Losing or endangering them was not a minor concern. Britain could not simply pour everything into North America, while other parts of its empire stood exposed. France and Spain understood this. The wider war forced Britain into choices. Every ship sent to one theater was not somewhere else. Every regiment held for defense could not pursue Washington. Every imperial emergency weakened the fantasy that America could be restored by concentrated pressure. What had once seemed like a colonial rebellion now competed with global priorities. This did not make American victory automatic. Britain remained dangerous. Its navy still fought fiercely. Its armies remained capable. Its political leadership did not instantly accept defeat. Wars of empire can continue long after their original logic has begun to decay, because prestige, sunk cost, and fear of precedent keep governments moving. George III and those who supported the war believed the stakes remained enormous. If the colonies were allowed to go, what did that say about imperial authority elsewhere? But the wider war changed the meaning of perseverance. For Americans, survival became strategy. If they could stay in the field, if they could prevent collapse, if they could keep the alliance alive, time might turn against Britain. The rebellion no longer had to defeat the British Empire alone. It had to endure long enough for Britain's enemies and Britain's burdens to multiply. This is where patience became a weapon. The American side had many frustrations with its French ally. Alliances are rarely sentimental arrangements. They involve mistrust, delay, negotiation, pride, and competing priorities. American leaders wanted support focused on their struggle. France had a global war to manage. French commanders and American commanders did not always see the same path. Naval movements depended on weather, orders, supply, and wider strategy. Hope could rise or collapse with the appearance of sails on the horizon. Yet the alliance gave the Americans what they had lacked most: the ability to challenge British command of the sea at decisive moments. That mattered because Britain's war in America depended on movement and supply. Armies did not feed themselves by confidence. They needed ships, ports, ammunition, clothing, reinforcements, communications. If British forces could be isolated, even temporarily, their professional strength could become vulnerability. The war had become a contest of coordination. Could Britain hold together a global imperial defense while suppressing rebellion in America? Could the Americans coordinate with French power across language, distance, politics, and military culture? Could a French fleet arrive at the right place at the right time? Could an American army and allied troops take advantage before the moment passed? These questions would eventually gather around Yorktown. But before that ending, the wider war had already done serious damage to Britain's hopes. It made this conflict more expensive. It complicated strategy. It encouraged British critics who doubted the war's purpose. It gave Americans reason to continue through hardship. It made the king's determination look, to opponents, less like strength and more like refusal to recognize reality. George III did not lose America because France simply appeared and solved the problem for the rebels. That would be another oversimplification. The Americans had to create a cause worth supporting, hold together enough political structure to make alliance meaningful, and keep fighting through years when defeat was entirely possible. But without the wider war, Britain's chances of forcing some form of submission or negotiated dependency would have been far stronger. France did not invent the American Revolution. It made British victory far harder, and there is a final irony here. The 7 Years' War had helped create the imperial crisis by leaving Britain victorious, indebted, enlarged, and eager to reorganize America. Now, the rivalries left unresolved by that earlier global conflict returned to break Britain's concentration. The empire's triumph over France had helped set the colonies on the road to rebellion. France's revenge helped make that rebellion survive. History often has a cruel sense of symmetry. By the early 1780s, Britain was not simply asking how to defeat Washington. It was asking how to fend an empire under pressure across oceans. The American War had become one part of a larger struggle, and not always the part London could treat as most urgent. That was the strategic disaster. The Crown still claimed authority over the colonies, but the material ability to enforce that claim was being diluted by the scale of imperial war. Power, stretched too widely, can begin to resemble weakness. Not because it disappears, because it cannot be everywhere with equal force. The king still had armies. Parliament still had authority. The Navy still had guns. British commanders still had plans. But the old confidence, the belief that America could be contained, punished, and restored, was being worn down by distance, alliance, and the demands of a world war. The rebellion had escaped the frame Britain first placed around it. It was no longer merely a colonial problem. It had become an imperial crisis, and empires are most vulnerable when every distant possession starts asking for protection at once. Yorktown was not supposed to become the place where Britain's American dream began to die. It was a small Virginia port town, useful because of its position, not because destiny had marked it on the map. Armies do not usually march into symbols. They march into roads, harbors, supply problems, weather, orders, and limited choices. Only later does history place a frame around the scene and say, here, this is where the illusion ended. For Britain, the Southern War had promised a way out of frustration. If New England remained stubborn, if the middle colonies proved difficult to pacify, perhaps the South could be reclaimed through loyalist strength, military pressure, and control of key territory. The strategy had some logic. There were loyalists in the South. There were divisions among Americans. There were enslaved people weighing British promises and patriot hypocrisy with clear eyes. There were native nations and frontier conflicts that made the war far more complicated than a simple struggle of redcoats against patriots. But the South did not become the stable loyalist foundation Britain hoped for. Instead, it became a hard, bitter theater of war. Local violence intensified. Patriot and loyalist communities attacked and punished one another. British victories won ground without always securing obedience. Commanders could defeat armies and still face resistance that returned in altered form. The countryside refused to behave like conquered territory. Lord Cornwallis, operating in this difficult environment, moved into Virginia. His army eventually took position at Yorktown, where access to the Chesapeake seemed to offer the possibility of supply, reinforcement, or evacuation by sea. That assumption depended on a larger imperial confidence that the British Navy could still keep open the necessary door. At Yorktown, that door closed. The arrival and action of French naval power in the Chesapeake changed the equation. This is the part of the story that deserves more attention than it sometimes receives. Yorktown was not only a triumph of American persistence or British error. It was the result of coordination, difficult, unlikely, and time-sensitive, between American forces, French troops, and the French fleet. The war had become global, and at Yorktown the global war entered a Virginia harbor. Washington saw the opportunity. French cooperation made the opportunity real. Allied forces converged. Cornwallis found himself trapped between land and sea, with escape uncertain and relief blocked. A British army that might have survived in another setting became vulnerable because the wider imperial system failed to connect at the decisive moment. This was the nightmare of fighting across an ocean. An army could be brave, disciplined, and experienced, yet still depend on ships that could not arrive. A commander could hold position, send messages, wait for help, and discover that strategy had become geography. The British Empire's strength had always rested on connection. Yorktown revealed what happened when connection broke. The siege that followed was not merely a dramatic closing scene. It was labor, artillery, trenches, engineering, pressure, exhaustion, and calculation. Siege warfare has a different rhythm from open battle. It tightens. It measures distance. It reduces hope by increments. Each parallel dug, each gun placed, each bombardment endured, brought Cornwallis closer to the recognition that his army's position could not be sustained. When surrender came in October 1781, it did not instantly end the war. That is worth saying clearly. Britain did not sign away the colonies the next morning. Armies still existed. Fighting and negotiations continued. The British Empire remained powerful. George III did not suddenly become powerless because one army surrendered in Virginia, but Yorktown destroyed something less visible and more important: the belief that the rebellion could still be reversed by force on terms Britain could bear. A battlefield defeat can sometimes be absorbed. States lose battles and continue wars. But Yorktown struck at the political imagination in London. It showed that Britain was not merely facing scattered colonial resistance. It was facing an American cause sustained by foreign alliance, protected at key moments by naval power, and capable of trapping a royal army far from easy rescue. The news traveled across the Atlantic into a Britain already burdened by cost, criticism, and global pressure. For supporters of the war, it was a shock. For critics, it was evidence that the ministry's strategy had failed. The question was no longer simply whether Britain had the right to hold America. It was whether Britain could do so without exhausting itself and endangering other imperial interests. That distinction matters. Governments do not always abandon claims because they are persuaded by moral argument. More often, they abandon them when the cost of enforcement becomes intolerable. The American patriots had spent years arguing rights, consent, liberty, and tyranny. Those arguments gave the cause meaning. But Yorktown gave Britain a different kind of argument, the argument of practical defeat. It said, in effect, that restoration was no longer a policy. It was a hope wearing a uniform. George III struggled against that conclusion. His commitment to preserving the empire had been sincere, stubborn, and deeply tied to his understanding of sovereignty. To accept American independence meant more than losing land. It meant accepting that rebellion had succeeded, that the authority of crown and parliament had limits, and that the imperial family could not simply discipline its children back into obedience. For a monarch shaped by duty and order, that was a bitter lesson. Yet even kings must eventually govern through reality. After Yorktown, British politics shifted. Confidence in the war weakened. The ministry associated with the conflict lost ground. Peace negotiations became not an act of generosity, but an acknowledgement of strategic failure. The empire had not been defeated everywhere. Britain would survive. It would remain a major power. But the old American empire, the idea that 13 colonies could be restored as loyal dependencies after years of blood, declarations, alliances, and accusation, was gone. That is why Yorktown belongs not only to military history, but to the history of illusions. The illusion that a people could be frightened back into affection. The illusion that loyalist support could replace trust. The illusion that occupying cities meant controlling a continent. The illusion that naval supremacy would always be present at the exact place it was needed. The illusion that a king's authority, once challenged, could be made whole again by victory in the field. Yorktown exposed each one. And still, the surrender scene should not be treated as simple humiliation. The British soldiers who laid down arms were not symbols alone. They were men at the end of a failed campaign, many of them exhausted, sick, frightened, and far from home. The American and French forces were not merely actors in a patriotic tableau. They were participants in a fragile coalition whose success had depended on timing, discipline, and the rare alignment of land and sea. History often turns such moments into statues, but the living moment was uncertain, muddy, loud, and human. The deeper meaning emerged afterward, when London had to decide what Yorktown proved. Could the war continue? Technically, yes. Could Britain still inflict damage? Certainly. Could it restore the colonies as they had been before 1775? That was the question Yorktown made almost impossible to answer honestly. The empire had reached the end of persuasion by force. It had taken years for Britain to arrive there. Years of underestimating colonial resolve. Years of overestimating loyalist mobilization. Years of confusing military success with political recovery. Years of treating the rebellion as something that could be contained before the wider world turned it into an imperial emergency. At Yorktown, all those errors gathered. The crown's grip did not break because one town possessed magic. It broke because Yorktown revealed the accumulated weakness beneath Britain's apparent strength. The empire still had armies, ships, money, and pride. But it no longer had a convincing path back to the old relationship. And when an empire loses the path back, even victory elsewhere cannot restore what has already changed. George III did not lose America alone. That is the first honest thing to say at the end of this story. It is tempting to place the whole catastrophe on one crowned head. The stubborn king, the distant king, the monarch who refused to listen until 13 colonies slipped from his empire. The Declaration of Independence helped fix that image in memory, and for the purposes of revolution, it served its role well. A people breaking from monarchy needed monarchy to have a face. But history is less obedient than accusation. Britain lost America through a convergence of forces larger than any single man. Debt mattered. Distance mattered. The old habits of colonial autonomy mattered. Parliamentary sovereignty mattered. The 7 Years' War mattered, because victory left Britain enlarged, indebted, and eager to reorganize an empire that had long survived by not defining itself too sharply. The colonists mattered too, not as a single pure people, but as divided, ambitious, fearful, principled, self-interested, and increasingly confident communities. They had learned to govern locally, argue publicly, organize resistance, and imagine rights as something more than gifts from London. They were loyal for a long time, but their loyalty depended on a particular kind of empire. Distant, flexible, protective, and careful not to press too hard on the question of consent. After 1763, Britain pressed. It pressed for revenue. It pressed for obedience. It pressed for administrative order. It pressed because officials believed the empire could not remain loose after such an expensive war. From London, this was discipline after victory. From America, it became evidence of a dangerous redesign. George III stood at the center of that pressure. He was not the only author of imperial policy, but he was not innocent of it either. He believed resistance must be checked. He supported firmness. He rejected the idea that armed colonists could force the empire to retreat while still claiming the privileges of loyalty. In his mind, authority had to mean something, or the empire would become a polite fiction. The tragedy was that America had already been living inside that fiction and had mistaken it for freedom. Or perhaps Britain had mistaken it for obedience. That is the deeper contradiction. The old empire worked because both sides interpreted it differently. Britain believed sovereignty remained intact even when enforcement was relaxed. Colonists believed their liberties were real because they had been practiced for generations. The system survived while the questions stayed blurred. It broke when war debt, reform, fear, and pride demanded a clear answer. Who ruled? Who paid? Who consented? Who belonged? Once those questions were asked directly, the old language of family could not bear the weight. Britain called itself parent. America began to reject the role of child. The king, once imagined as protector, became in American eyes the symbol of a power that would rather punish than understand. Yorktown did not destroy Britain. The loss of America did not end the British Empire. In time, Britain would build new imperial structures elsewhere, often with even harsher forms of control. George III would continue to reign for decades, and his life would later be shaped in public memory not only by America, but by illness, family, war with revolutionary France, and the strange endurance of monarchy itself. But America changed what the crown could pretend. It proved that oceanic empire had limits. It proved that subjects who had learned local political confidence could not always be managed as distant dependents. It proved that military power could win battles and still fail to restore legitimacy. And it proved that a king could remain on his throne while losing the story that had once bound people to him. So was George III, the king who lost America? Yes, but only if the phrase is understood carefully. He lost it as the monarch who became the focus of colonial anger. He lost it as the sovereign who would not become the mediator Americans hoped for. He lost it as the symbolic head of a system that confused authority with attachment and punishment with repair. But Britain lost America as an empire through debt, distance, blindness, rigidity, and the failure to understand that loyalty is not merely commanded. It is maintained, it is negotiated, it is felt. And once it is no longer felt, even the most powerful crown in the world becomes only metal across the sea.